Can you all see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Good.
Okay, great. We're live on the YouTube stream now, so whenever Fabricio, whenever you're ready. I can help click the record button if that's helpful.
I was gonna say, do we also have to record too?
Yeah, we do. Fabricio, should I do that?
Yes, please.
Okay, one moment. Please speak now if you do not consent to recording. All right, Fabricio, take it away.
Okay. Yeah, today I would like to talk about the installers. So I think many people just know one or maybe two of them. First, I would like to give an introduction about our team. So the installer team is composed by Brian, Dennis, myself. So I forgot to introduce myself. Well, my name is Fabricio, and I'm from Pulp team, and I work at the Pulp installer team and the CI team. Matthias and Mike, would you like to introduce yourselves?
We can skip that part.
Okay. Yeah, the easy way to reach us is through IRC on Freenode at Pulp and Pulp Dev channel, and at the mailing lists at Pulp List and Pulp Dev. So I think the most usable installer is the Pulp installer. It is a collection at Galaxy. We can install Pulp from PyPI, RPM, or even local repos, what we use for dev environment. And we have a documentation at the read the docs. I can open it here. So it describes every role that we use with the variables, and there is pretty of useful information there. And about that, I would like to talk about some concepts that we have, like roles, that are individual role, like for starting a web server or something very specific, like Pulp API. And we have a prerequisite roles that is the roles prerequisite for a specific plugin. So far, we just have it for RPM. And we have the meta roles that it is a set of roles that installs Pulp. So we can gather some roles under the Pulp service, like Pulp API, Pulp web service, and so on. And we have Pulp list. It's not exactly an installer, but we use it for dev environment. It makes use of Pulp installer to get a Vagrant environment set up. And we have just, for documentation, we just have the README at the repository. And we have now single container images. We majorly use it for the CI. And the only documentation we have for it so far is at the pulpproject.org. So here we provide a few steps to get to build the container. And the last is the Pulp operator. So we have operator for Pulp tree and documentation at read the docs. And we are planning to work more on Pulp operator on the next term. And I think the major problem that we have so far is about documentation because each installer provides its own documentation, but we have mentions about the installer at the Pulp core and at the plugins, like you can see here. So core provides a few notes on some installations, like the recommended one that uses Pulp installer, some PyPI, and a bunch of plugins do the same. So it is easy to get outdated and it's hard to keep up because whenever you make some change at a Pulp installer, you would maybe have to change on every plugin. So that starts my first questions about how can I improve the user experience with the installers, because we have multiple docs everywhere and we don't know, maybe a user come just for use Pulp RPM and the first reference for installer that he or she will get will be the documentation for listed on Pulp RPM plugin that may be or not outdated. So I would like to talk about the ideas, suggestions for we improve our documentation.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the main thing I'm hearing here is that we need one place where we talk about the installer and that all plugins reference that one place and not have any sort of examples of their own, because those examples are always going to be out of date. It doesn't matter if we updated it today, tomorrow it's going to be out of date. And we've started providing some document. We have only made this worse. We have the read the docs site for the installer itself, which is great. But we also have some information in Pulp Core's documentation. And I think we need to combine all of this into one place. And with our effort to publish all the docs on docs.pulpproject.org, I think we're going to have an opportunity to put it all on that one website. And it'll probably be under the Pulp Core name, or perhaps it can have its own URL Pulp installer there, but everything should link to there.
And Dennis, along with what you're saying, just to share it, part of the docs goal that you just identified is to have a unified browsing experience, to deduplicate the docs between what are currently different independent sites, and to try to allow a single left navigation or some sort of navigation to allow you to move to the different areas, what are now different sites, to be one site. So the installer would be one major section of there, and to the point about deduplication, we would be deduplicating what we now spread across two different sites. And another point about deduplication is the quick start guides. Right now, most of the plugins contain an installer config. Like, use this config with the installer, and you'll get the installed plugin. And what would be great is if the installer section maybe would have that in it. Perhaps that's the right way to organize it. Perhaps the plugins themselves still should have it, but there should be one place versus what we do now.
Fabricio, just what you went over right now, I feel like someone coming to the website and looking through all of the different options that we're giving them, even before they get to the docs, I can see that someone needs that, what you just did basically, but they don't have to watch a video to find it, but I want to go install Pulp, and I don't even know which one to start with. Like, there's so many options, and I don't even know, and they know, but they just say, I want to install Pulp. That's all they know. But for them, it's almost like we need to give them some questions. Like, are you trying to do a dev environment? Are you just trying to check it out? Do you require RPMs in your environment? Like, just sort of giving them a little bit of that decision flow chart kind of thing that you kind of outlined there of like, this is why I want to go install Pulp. Like, which one should I use? Because even before getting to the, like, how do I actually run this installer? Like, there's this decision point, and you just pointed out very nicely and illustrated like how many different options we give them. And a lot of them may be like, I don't care. Like, I just, like, I just want to start. And this is, what I think as far as like what I need. And I just don't even know what to do here. So some sort of opinionated, like, if you're doing this, go here, kind of list of different ways that they can make their decision of which documentation do I even go look at. I think it's definitely very well illustrated by the slides that you just presented to us.
And maybe also writing down a paragraph for each type of installer, like what is the purpose for Pulp installer, what is the purpose of Pulp Lift. Like, if you plan to try it out and have some hands-on experience, this is the use case, so use this sort of installer. If you plan to set it up in production, better use other installer. Because, yeah, Ruben is right. Yeah. There are a lot of options, and you don't really understand which option is the best use case for your situation.
Yep. So I really like that we now have a drop-down on our website for the different installation methods. In addition to that, I think we need to have like an installation landing page that provides that information. As Enid said, like, for this use case, do this. For this other use case, do that. And then link to those pages. I mean, obviously we still want to have them available in the menu, but just an additional installation page outlining the different use cases. Very briefly.
I think in calling back to the discussion we had yesterday, Monday, I'm sorry, this whole year blurs, about the switch we're going through between switching from how do we get more developer contributors to how do we get enlarge the user base. If we think of those as two big use cases, if the I want to use Pulp starts with two use cases. The first one is, what's the fastest way to get a Pulp demo up and running and have a, here's the 3 steps you follow and it'll get it up and running and you can play with it. Maybe even, sorry, I'm stop designing. The second one is I want to change Pulp. I want to do development for Pulp. And then there's advanced cases, which is where we get to split out into all the, I want to run it in this particular production environment, or I have to use RPMs, or I love Ina's mask. That could be like I already know I'm an advanced user, or I know what I'm doing, lead them off to somewhere else. But the main page separate into those two user communities that we've been talking about, and just not developing, I have no idea what you guys are about. Here's the fastest way to get it up and running. I am a developer, I want to help. Here's the fastest way to get you up and running. And then everything else is an advanced topic kind of thing. How does that sound to folk?
Yeah, sounds good to me. I was thinking like something in the format of frequently asked questions like, oh, I wanted to get it to run. How can I do it? And you just suggest, oh, go with container and so on. But going to the specifics of the documentation, as we talked about Pulp Lift a couple days ago, I think maybe yesterday, like, let me share my screen. So I think, let me go back to the Pulp Lift. So Pulp Lift has like the installer as a sub-repo, and all the major things you have on your environment are done through the installer, but many people don't know that. And let me see, where is the installer docs? Here. So I thought that, no, that is, let me try to get the link here. Here. So when you talk about the development environment, the major things we have on Uplift are here. And a topic that came up was about the aliases, and we have it here. So we are failing to communicate or on installing procedures even with ourselves. So I think the Uplift has this challenge. And I would like to talk a little bit more about it. What do you think? How can we facilitate the documentation of Pulp Lift? Because Pulp Lift is kind of a proxy for Pulp Installer, and I think many users don't know that.
Yeah. First of all, I think it's a good idea to have the documentation of the installer in the installer repo, because with every change you can get the installation in the same version. So I'm not sure whether this combined browsing experience thing would be possible with taking documentation source from different places. I hope so. When you said that the Pulp Lift is mostly a proxy to Pulp Installer, I just thought maybe it's time to merge those repositories into one. I think we just recently started to have a CI on Pulp Lift that just runs the installer. So that would be really interesting to use as the CI for the installer.
That is an interesting idea. And I think it could actually work just fine because whenever we publish the installer as a collection, we just build it out of the Pulp installer directory, and Pulp Lift is just a few configuration files itself. So as far as combining them, it makes total sense. Right now in Pulp Lift, Pulp installer lives as a submodule. And so they are already one repository. And so what this would allow us to do is to combine that documentation and make Pulp Lift one of the ways to run the installer, basically from source. And I guess we could make it so then it doesn't have to even be from source. And that if you want to use the published version, you could use it. But to begin with, I think it would be from source.
Just so I understand, the idea is to consolidate these repos?
That's right.
Good. That would be also beneficial because of the CI issues that we experienced today. Because changes happen in the installer, and PulpLift has its own CI, which Mike and Daniel showed us a little bit of yesterday, which is really fantastic. But if there's a problem, you actually don't discover it until post merge time, which is not when you want to be finding out problems. So this will make that better.
Yeah, and the added benefit, towards the documentation would be that PulpLift would become part of the installer documentation also. It would give us an opportunity to present it as a way for users to experience Pulp. And I think maybe it would be easier to get contributions that way also, because it would be very clear how you can set up a dev environment using the installer.
So talking about my perspective about that, I am at the Pulp team. I started to work at the Pulp installer team, and it took me months to realize that when I have a problem at Pulp Lift, I have to look at the Pulp installer. So even with me that worked at the installer team, took me a while to realize that. So it's not an easy experience for people outside the Pulp team, even in the Pulp team.
Yep, there's a lot of pieces. And combining them will definitely simplify things.
And I think it's definitely possible to say the Vagrant has a dependency on the Galaxy version of the installer. So that we can even install some boxes from the Galaxy published version and some from source.
And that would actually be really good for troubleshooting problems that are reported against a specific release of Pulp.
Hey, one piece of feedback I just wanted to mention about the installer documentation is it's written in very technical terms. Like I was just looking at it, and it tells you how to install a plugin using the installer, how to install a plugin using pip, but it doesn't tell me, like, as a user, like, how do I add a plugin to an existing installation? I kind of have to discern that.
By developers for developers.
Well,
Yeah,
and to be
that's
fair,
very
Dan,
true.
speaking as one of the developers, it's still confusing
Yeah,
because I'm a
yeah.
dumb developer. So,
Written by confused developers for confused developers.
there we go. That's perfect. This is this kind of this is part of this whole transition. And like Mel, I expect we're going to start leaning kind of hard on you as we do this. As okay, we've got the developer to developer conversation. Here's my idea of a chattier or more informal, hey, you want to use Pulp, and here's the way to get it done, and pass that over to you so you can remove the remaining bits of developer to developer ease and make it more consumable by folk who are experienced engineers but not necessarily developers. And that's the growing the user community to non-contributors part that I'm really I'm kind of groping about how all the places we can approach to do that, because we've got a lot of flexibility, right? We as a team have responded to everyone's requests. Can you make it possible to install Pulp in this particular way? I mean, sure, we can do that for this one person. That's part of what got us where we are right now, and it's great and good, and we need to have all of those. But for the person who's coming in who just wants their problem to be solved, I want to manage content, we have to simplify all those options and be more prescriptive and say, do one of these two things. And then after they say, but I have this other set of needs. Okay, now you're an advanced user. We fulfill that, but now you have to go read the harder documentation. And I expect it'll take some time for us to get a flow in the docs that makes this easier. But I think this is the right path to be on.
So to talk about like the install strategy, like other way to go about installing a plugin. So currently, like we have this data structure for the installer called Pulp install plugins, and the like individual role readmes or like man pages. If you ever look at the man page or things like sed or whatever, they're not meant for people that try to learn how to use sed. They're meant for people that already know how to use sed, but they need to look up the reference. If you were to write a complete tutorial on how do you add a plugin and you deal with the fact that you have to pick the correct version, if you write some sort of README on that, it would just be very long. And our plan was for the entire process of figure out I want to add adding a plugin or specifying which plugins I want to install the entire process should be made easier thanks to tooling that Fabricio is working on, and then we write a nice guide on how to do it.
So I think that's an excellent comparison. And we don't want to lose the reference style that we have right now. It serves its purpose, to your point. The goal of attracting a larger user base to have even more and more people use Pulp, I think is going to motivate us to write that other guide. And long though it may be, we'll need to try to make it great somehow by dividing it up into lots of subpages, making sure there's discoverability, making sure it's search indexed, all the things.
Right. We could write the long guide right now, and then once the tooling's ready, make it shorter. The guide would be probably another page of the installer docs.
Yep. Related to that, one of my general concerns with the installer is that while Ansible is great and it's quickly, if not already, the dominant configuration management it's not a language, technology in the industry, the problem with our installer is that you have to know Ansible to some extent, even basic things, but you still have to know something about Ansible to use it. And this creates a binary value problem for Pulp, where in order to experience Pulp, you also have to experience Ansible. And that holds us back. I think it holds back users from using Pulp. And I don't think I'm not proposing any changes to the installer itself. It runs in Ansible. That's not going to change. That's our horse to ride. But I do think that options like the other, to Fabrizio's point, that we have other just as good installers like the OCI images, which you can literally just Docker start or Podman start. And highlighting those perhaps a bit more, I think, can solve this binary value problem. That's one thing I'm worried about.
No, I like that. I like that idea. Before I forget, Mike, I really like your comparison of the reference docs we have to man pages. I think it's very apropos, and you're right. Man pages are not something you go to learn how to use a thing, but boy, are they useful. So we definitely want to keep those. Brian, to go down your OCI image, if I think about some of the comments that we've had and that we've all said in terms of being able to experiment with Pulp, having that all in one image be the answer to, okay, I don't know what Pulp is. Show me what Pulp is. And if we had here's everything in a container, including, it's already got 4 of our fixtures synced. So it's already got data available there. It has Zoo and a couple of other of the fixtures that we use. So run this, it'll be up and running in the container. And then on your command line, you can start doing these kinds of things to look at it. Feels like a way to get right to a running instance without and sidestep the entire installation process. And I really like that idea of that all the plugins with some amount of content, so the user who just wants to take it out for a spin can do that with a very small number of steps. It would be optimal from my point of view. I really like that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that we can get to the point where our single container is not just a try it out mechanism, but actually something that we can encourage folks to use in production.
I agree.
Yeah, another thing we should definitely keep on doing is be on the lookout for any tools that'll help us wrap the installer to make it a lot easier for people to use. Like something that can just simply create a CLI around the installer.
Yes.
So like Foreman has something like that. I'm trying to, I evaluated it and determined it would not make things significantly easier, only like a tiny bit easier, you know? I'm trying to figure out
Yeah,
the name of it. OBOL.
yeah.
OBOL would not make things significantly easier for everybody, for our users, but it does go to show that there is such it is possible to create like a just easy to figure out CLI for Ansible. If anybody sees any more tooling like that, please let us know.
So
The
Douglas,
problem,
what is your experience with the installer and just getting Pulp deployed?
So for us, the most beneficial part, or the bit that we leveraged the most, was the documentation relating to PyPy. And the reason why I say that is we use RPM internally. So we just replace the PyPy section with the RPM install. And it gives a clear indication of expected services to be running on ports and what needs to be installed. We didn't look at the installer at all because we're not an Ansible shop. We use Salt internally, and we have no desire to use Ansible to manage our configuration. So it would need to go into Salt. Being said, when the more nuanced configuration was required, I believe, I don't know who pointed me in the direction, but Sign-in IRC pointed me in the direction of the installer. And one of the benefits of Ansible is it's a fairly, I've never used it before, yet the configuration files are relatively easy to follow. So for me personally, being able to review the installer and take certain bits out of that and transfer it into Salt, it worked reasonably well. If we didn't have the original set of documents relating to just using PyPy, I'm not sure what we would have done. I think it would have been much harder to get off the ground. I think the image discussion is incredibly useful for people that just want to try it out. I'd be surprised if people were going down the Pulp installer route to simply try it out. That seems like the perfect solution. But for someone that's looking to actually deploy infrastructure internally, yeah, not having that initial PyPy documentation would have made it painful.
Cool. Yeah. And that it's been a struggle also keeping that up to date, that PyPy documentation, because that's another, installation path that we have to keep up to date. But I'm glad to hear that it is useful.
Yeah, it definitely was useful because it is effectively completely independent. You can replace the PyPy element with building out your RPMs and, my God, dealing with the dependency tree.
So did you package all the RPMs yourself?
Unfortunately.
Good job.
Took a while.
Yeah, I bet. It's a lot of dependencies.
Yeah. But that's completely replaced by the RPM process, and then it's just a very quick overview of these configuration files need to be set. These services need to be running. You need to set up the Postgres DB. The only bit, I mentioned it yesterday, the only bit that seemed to be missing from that very high level was the requirement for a reverse proxy listed anywhere. So that was a surprise to me when I was trying to work out why is nothing connecting to anything, and the client connection doesn't actually appear to support port configurations, and certainly not.
I remember this discussion on IRC.
Yes, yes. I'll be back in 2 days and set up HA proxy.
Do you open an issue against us?
I will do. I was thinking about it yesterday. I will do.
Yes, please. Because I mean, this is incredibly valuable insight that you're giving to me, at least, and I don't want it lost. And you know, we don't get to all the issues right away, but if they're out there, they're searchable, and we go, "Oh shit, that's something we have to work on next sprint." So please do find stuff like that.
You guys have fixed pretty much all of the issues that I've raised. Some of them coding, some of them documentation. So surprisingly quickly. Well, maybe not surprisingly quickly, but quickly.
So I want to introduce two more topics about the installer, then we go back to discussion. Let me share my screen here. So my mix open, yeah. So yeah, I put our GitHub handles here. It was not by accident, because as I said before, it took me a while to understand that for understand Pulp lift, we have to go to Pulp installer, and I'm failing to communicate that. And I think every time you see some fail, or when you see that it's pretty hard to follow some procedure on the documentation about on installers, feel free to ping us. And it's hard to write a good documentation, because you have to think like a user that is seeing it for the first time, and feedbacks will help a lot of us. So please reach us on IRC or the mailing lists. But going back to the presentation, I think one of the greatest pain points we face so far is about the dependency management, because each plugin can have a different requirement about Pulp core. So we release a Pulp core today, and maybe just Pulp Ansible is compatible, but you also need Pulp RPM, and it probably will break your installation. I start some third-party lib for just listen what versions are compatible with determined Pulp core version. But I think it's like a quick way to just expose it, but it's not the best way to solve the problem. I'm starting a POC about a plugin for checking the compatibility and giving some friendly error message, because sometimes our installer fails and it's hard to understand that is because of the version's compatibility.
Yep. And even though we're gonna require that, you know, Pulp core stay backwards compatible for 2 releases, this is still going to be useful, because the one upgrade is going to go smoothly because everything is still compatible. But then the next upgrade, there's still going to be something that's not compatible and you can't finish your upgrade. So we definitely need to make it very clear to the user what exactly the conflicts are, and not just the output that pip gives, which is really hard to read. Yeah, that plugin, the Ansible plugin, will be great, and we should definitely continue work on it.
Yep, this is exactly the tooling I was talking about. It's like, how do I go about installing a plugin? Well, the first thing you have to do is to determine which version of the plugins, which plugins you can install at which versions.
Yep.
That's more difficult than figuring out the config file syntax.
Yeah, and I think that's why just increasing the deprecation cycle of Pulp core plugin interfaces is just so critically important. And I'm really glad that with 3.7 that's happening. And we should consider maybe even making it longer. We'll see.
Yeah, right. I'm just going to say that window really helps, but it doesn't completely solve the problem. And I think longer term, we're going to need to give some thought to, okay, what do we do with a plugin that we're not maintaining that is just kind of falling behind? And I'm not sure that there's a thing to do, but it's a problem that is going to bite us at some point. Is that plugin could work because we haven't upgraded any APIs that it depends on, but because of the way it's spec, it suddenly stops being installable because nobody updated the spec file and it's not ours. This is the kind of problem that having community plugins is something we have to at least have thought about how to deal with, so that we, how Fedora, for example, has a whole process for marking maintainers as unresponsive and marking packages as retired, and because they're not being updated. Down the road a ways, those are the kinds of problems that we're likely to have to start being able to deal with. And it's not an immediate problem. It may not even be a Pulp 3 problem, but soonish, in the next year or two, we are absolutely going to have to think about process for marking Pulp plugins as not current and not usable with the current release of Pulp.
Yeah, or updating them, but fair point either way.
If we can, yeah.
And I agree with you that situation is especially problematic because it's one thing if a single piece of software is fallen out of maintenance and out of date, and because it is not current enough, it cannot be used. This happens all the time in software land. What doesn't happen so often is the situation we have, which is where a single user's installation is using 5 plugins, and because one plugin is out of date, they can no longer use the remaining 4, which are perfectly good. And this is a really tricky situation.
Exactly right. And it's you guys have heard me say, with the vices of our virtues, the virtues of the architecture we have is anybody can create plugins without waiting for us to do it. And that's great. And if that person stops maintaining it, we're kind of stuck. And that we have to figure out how to address that.
I just have one really quick last topic to talk about. Let me share my screen again. The last thing I want to talk about is web server. We use white noise to proxy the request to Django. And right now, Pulp installer, it's supposed to be, it counts to we only use Pulp for it because white noise kind of takes all requests for it. So it is not a documented thing so far that we expect to just the Pulp to be only installed there. So I would ask the community, what about that? If you have use case that we're using Pulp alongside other web service config. And I think, that's the last talk that I want to bring. I will stop my share screen and we can talk more about it.
So Fabrizio, just because I think I'm a little confused, is the problem that you're stating here that our current installation process makes the assumption that Pulp is the only thing responding to the web server, and that doesn't match a lot of people's configuration?
Yes, I don't know if it doesn't match a lot of people, but
yeah, that's the question.
Yeah.
I see. So essentially, it's running by itself, if you will, on a given box.
Yeah, and part of the we've seen that it's a problem in practice. For example, Galaxy NG would like to since they offer view sets that are similar to some of the Pulp Ansible view sets, they would like to not have some of the Pulp Ansible view sets routed. But the way that the route structure is set up in our Nginx and Apache configs, they can't do that. But also at the same time, Galaxy NG wants to host and needs to host a UI at the root of the web server. That way, when a user browses to what they feel is just the root of the application, they receive the UI. So we still need to be able to serve static assets at that location. And so it's just tricky business. So that's one of the practical problems. The other issue, and I'm going to put a link here to the issue that's kind of tracking a little bit of that, but in a minute. The other issue is that, at least my belief is that it's fair and reasonable for users to want to deploy applications besides Pulp in the same URL namespace, because there are other, like, say you wanted to put, I mean, this is a silly example because I don't use the software anymore. I guess that's all I can really say about it. But say people wanted to put PHP MyAdmin, well, that's MySQL, but the Postgres equivalent to something like that, to be able to browse their database more directly through the web server. Pulp doesn't do that. Pulp never, I think, is going to do that, and the other applications do. And so I think there is a motivation for external tooling that works for your Pulp installation. It's not that you're just trying to cram a bunch of apps into it. So for all these reasons, the situation that Fabrizio is describing is tricky business, and it's also really important. But not everyone may believe that we should be allowing other applications side-by-side Pulp. But then usually this is the part of the meeting where someone points out that Catello is actually a application that runs side-by-side Pulp. Or actually Pulp 2 itself is an application that runs side-by-side Pulp.
Yeah, exactly. And so Catello works around this by not using white noise at all. And they serve the static assets using web server config that serves the files from the file system.
And that's great for them. I mean, it's perfect. But they've had to spend effort handcrafting that, and what they can't do is consume the value that the installer presents to them.
Exactly. I completely agree with that. And I'm thinking that maybe our config needs to do the same thing.
Go ahead, Mike.
I mean, my thoughts on this subject are, like, I think the global, like, redirect, the global forwarding on the web server is only it's only needed for Galaxy NG, correct?
No, because yeah, well, very soon it's not going to be. I mean, right? There's a prototype for a UI to be served, and as soon as that occurs, it will need to be served up just like Galaxy NG's would be.
Right, but at the same time too, we could always have the UI under a folder path like Pulp UI, http://web server/Pulp UI, and the root can optionally redirect to that. We don't need.
Yeah, maybe it could redirect to that. I don't know. Maybe it could redirect to that. As long as users can browse to the root, then okay.
Yeah. Right. For our purposes, we could have the redirect. We don't need to monopolize the / namespace. A simple redirect file, whatever, would suffice,
But I guess I'm saying that, I mean, at that point we're splitting hairs because we're still occupying the root namespace. We're just doing so with a redirect.
Yeah, but I thought, but even then, the point is that then everything else under the root folder path other than /index.htm or whatever would be, would not be controlled by us. And
yep. It's complicated.
I mean, what I'm getting from this is there's an assumption that is incorrect, which is that we own and can do whatever we want with that space. And however we solve this problem, we have real world use cases. We have to make it relatively straightforward for Pulp to share the wealth, if you will, of the root that people are getting to at 80 and 443.
Yeah, I mean that's
Yeah.
my takeaways. Basically, we just have a problem, and I'm not exactly sure what we should do about it. And for example, 7471, this link in the chat, and I'll put it in the YouTube chat too, is like just one way that the problem shows itself.
So we just exceeded our time box. So I would share my screen just one last time, just for closing it. And I just wanted to share the screen again. We talked about documentation. We gave an overview about our installers, and we talked about the web server problem and the dependency management problem. But if you are facing other issues, please reach us. So here are our contacts. And thank you, everyone. And that's it.
Very cool. Thank you, Fabricio.
Thank you so
And
much.
thanks to
Fabricio.
the whole installer team, by the way. I'm not directly involved with what you all are doing, but just watching all of the progress that has been made in the last few months, 2 thumbs way up.
Thank you very much. It seems like it's good to hear that from outer perspective we're making a lot of progress in installer.
It's been a great mini team to work on, and if it wasn't stated here, Mike is the lead of that team, and everyone is a really strong contributor, I feel like, on this team.
Exactly. I'm impressed with how multiple people have ramped up.
I'm going to stop the recording now.
Yep.
All right. So what do we have up next? Oh, we have Melanie up next. Awesome. In 5 minutes.
Yes. Let's
Cool.
take a quick break.
6. Thank you.
See you in 5.
Hi, everyone.
How's it going, Max?
It's going good. Thanks. Going
Hey,
well.
can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Excellent. So you're making progress with ASCII Doc?
Yes, I am, or we are actually. Yeah.
Excellent.
The conversion has not taken place yet, so we're still on Sphinx. But I guess, well, should happen this year. Like maybe not this month or the next one, but yeah, should happen this year.
So
And
your earlier commitments of having things ready for OSAD may be debatable, is it?
yeah, to put it politely, yes. So bottom line, not gonna happen. We had a talk this week, and yeah, we're gonna postpone it to the next release.
That's okay. It took, to be honest, the first guide that we did took an enormous amount of time. And then it was really strange. The others, there was a few that installation was quite complex, for example. But then after that, we actually got through them very, very fast. So I think once you get over the first hurdle, the next ones will get easier and easier. But if you need any help, just we can meet and walk through.
Oh yeah, thanks for your offer. Yes, greatly appreciated. I think right now we're trying to iron out all the stuff that is happening behind it or besides it. For example, a GitLab pipeline to have, well, somewhat decent Docker images to build, to test, to deploy the documentation. So stuff like this. Yeah.
Cool. Very good. Okay, doke. We are past the. Oh my god! Look at that for a hat.
This is the hat I wear on the beach. I'm not on the beach.
You are safe from all UV rays and other rays, I imagine.
I'm working on my laptop tan.
So Brian, are you a son of the sea?
I am.
Or just a son of the beach?
I'm a son of the beach.
Should I get going or should I wait another minute or two? I don't know. Yeah, I suppose turning on camera is indication of of people being here, and by the looks of it, okay, we have a lot of people. Yeah, okay. So I'll begin. So just to preface this.
Melanie, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm gonna hit the record button now.
Oh yeah. Or do you want me to? Yeah, Are you doing it for everyone?
I'm just helping out.
All right, thanks.
Please let us know now if you do not want to be recorded.
So, hello and welcome. If anybody here hasn't met me before, my name is Melanie Kaur. I have been working for just under 6 months as the community manager for Pulp and also for the Foreman project, which has been quite interesting. Today is a follow-up session to an earlier session we had this week with Brian Bowders leading it about how we have decided as a community that we're going to move away from a contributor focused strategy in our community, which served a particular purpose in the earlier development of Pulp 3, and how we can move towards a more user focused strategy. I'm assuming I checked with a few people earlier. Please let me know if you can't see my screen. And just so you know as well, is that I have added some notes to this HackMD. I'll just share the link, actually, it would be helpful with the group. So I just share this link. I have added in several places. Please add and modify and add your contributions, anything that you think of. I frame this session largely as I've put in content largely to promote perhaps brainstorming, perhaps opinions for anybody who's here to think of things that they'd like to see or think of ideas or initiatives we could run. But I just wanted to start off with the Pulp community survey has been live for about a month now, and it's closing down this week. So if you're watching and you haven't done it, you still have a few days, but just about that. So I just cherry picked some information from that survey to serve myself. This isn't a reflection of the entire survey, but just a few comments that I thought would be interesting for this session. I'll just read them. So Pulp is the only open source binary repo I see has a potential to beat every other paid binary repo out there. You have a long way to go, but I'm happy to use Pulp. So far, the team has been doing a good job with the application. I feel the workflow could be more intuitive for users. And then when I told DevOps folks that I was working on installing Pulp, they reacted very negatively. It seems that Pulp 2 has a really bad reputation with those who were required to use Catello. They said that all issues with Catello were traced back to Pulp 2. Some kind of campaign might be required to change the perception of Pulp 3. So I suppose none of this is necessarily a surprise. A lot of this is positive, but we have some work to do. First thing on a very high level, and something I suppose that we can think about, and please interrupt me if, for example, interrupt me or add into this anything that you think that might be missing. But it's important to maybe think about what are our overall goals of a user-focused community strategy. Ina, yesterday or the day before, like Grant, my year has been a complete blur at this stage, but Ina was mentioning, and I've read a lot as well, that when you're a small open source community that's trying to grow organically, when you're in a small phase, you need to look at how to engage and grow your user base. If we were, for example, maybe a startup rather than, if we were a startup, for example, with a proof of concept, what one approach would be to raise a lot of funding and then spend all that funding on marketing and then just charge for services or something like that. But our growth model will have to be more organic. And I suppose in order to focus on users, we need to look at the improving the user experience. And that's something that it has been very nice to sit through the sessions this week, because I think the entire engineering team throughout their sessions are all largely focused on this, and every change that has been suggested this week I've seen has come back with the suggestion that perhaps we need to consider how big a change this will be and how big an impact this will be for the users who are upgrading, the users who have things deployed in a certain way. So it's really, I think we are thinking of that. So none of this will be necessarily new information. And then yesterday and during Fabrizio's session as well, we've been talking about onboarding. And I think that is, that's obviously a concern if we had like a full session around it. And Brian Carney mentioned yesterday as well, like how can a user go from learning about to installing Pulp within the same hour or afternoon or day? And I suppose it's important for us to maybe think about what's a realistic goal around that. And what's the best that we could achieve for a user experience around that. So in terms of a user-focused strategy, I think because we're small, we need to focus on our communication. I think that we have some challenges here, and also the usability of the product. In terms of communication, I have we've talked about some of this week as well, and it's helped me maybe frame this, but the project name Pulp makes it difficult, to search for, or makes it difficult for us to stand out just to random people. But at the same time, it maybe SEO is such a broad term that perhaps we shouldn't worry too much about it and just focus on targeting specific areas. One concern that I in particular have is this mailing list focus method of communication, of announcements and information sharing. It's a difficult one in terms of SEO. We aren't maximizing our potential impact to be discoverable. We had a user join on Monday and has suggested to us that our mailing list in particular, because it's a Red Hat mailing list, is very hard to discover. So I added that in as a potential concern. We are active on Freenode IRC, but perhaps the Pulp channel in itself, like Douglas Wibbett is quite active there. We have one or two people that are quite active there and that have that get support, but it isn't the same as, it isn't necessarily a hub of users helping other users. So perhaps we might look at other avenues around that, or adding, finding our base perhaps elsewhere. One thing I have observed is our change logs can be a bit cryptic. I think it was for the container plugin. Was it a few weeks ago? I was writing up a release announcement and I saw that like buried within was a comment that hasn't a bug. It was listed under bug fix. I think performance has improved 40% or something like this. And if I was a marketing manager or something like that, we should be screaming about this level of improvement, but it was very neatly tucked away in a very neat and ordered list. So I think that we could be doing perhaps a better job of celebrating some of the improvements as we move up versions. And then with COVID-19 as well, it presents opportunities, but it also presents difficulties. So for example, we have people hopping in and out now to PubCon that perhaps wouldn't be here if it wasn't for an online session. But also it's difficult perhaps to talk about things that you don't like necessarily to a group of strangers on a video call, and how can we perhaps work to increase any levels of engagement that we have lost through not being able to physically be in a room and at a conference booth talking to people. And then from Monday as well, we have historically low levels of social media engagement. I am trying to help with that, but we're at the beginning rather than even the midway with that. So and then I'm going to hopefully hear more from as this time progresses, this session progresses. But I just wanted I've been bad perhaps with reporting status, and I've perhaps not wanted to, I've been doing things but not necessarily wanting to be like, hey guys, look what I'm doing, because everything that I'm doing is to focus on growing the user base and to improve information for users. And I need the engineering team in particular should be just allowed to focus on their work without having to stare at all the things that I'm doing on a daily basis. But if we're going to, for example, tweet, if we're going to have higher levels of engagement, we need a steady cadence of content created. So for the first while that I have been here, I have been rewriting a lot. So I started off with the website. I started off with trying to identify some shortfalls and information. I've still some to do, some things on my to-do list for the website, but I have been trying very much with that. I've gotten involved with some release announcements as well, just trying to improve them. I've been trying basically as well to make our website a platform, so a reliable and up-to-date source of information about Pulp that Pulp users can rely on, rather than just having to dig around or go through the archive of a mailing list, that everything will be listed there and up to date with so that they can access what they need. I've also been looking for ways that we can, increase our engagement, reach people that might be interested in what we've been doing. So I've been kind of developing a network of, FOSS contacts and blogs in which we can distribute news about releases and just information about Pulp in general. And I've started a digestible monthly summary of release announcements, of events, of any kind of meetings or sessions that we've been having. And I've also started to work with getting content onto opensource.com, because that's actually quite a large platform for open source projects, and I think that they are going to get a bit better with what they will allow published about general open source projects. I heard that they will provide a platform for release announcements for things like that, for example, so that might grow. So at the moment, for example, if we have releases related to Ansible, we can get them published in the Ansible community newsletter. For RPM, they're happy in the CentOS community to take submissions from us. Neil was talking on Monday about Fedora magazine. I haven't looked at that yet. But also Python, I have contacted the curator of that Python Weekly News, and he's very happy to take submissions. I've reached out to Debian community, waiting to hear back from them, and continue to do this throughout all the plugins so that we can just perhaps spread the message about Pulp in that way. In terms of our channels of communication, the primary ones are IRC and mailing lists. As I mentioned, I wonder, we had suggestions earlier in the week to perhaps, we don't really have necessarily a hub of user activity on Freenode. So I wonder, should we start looking to maybe take a period of time, like a year, something like that, where just say the Pulp team moves on to Matrix, we bridge into other chat rooms, we see which ones are busier than others, and then perhaps we evaluate what direction we want to go in. And if there's a bit of a split throughout, we could work over a timeline to get people onto another channel, and then we have one or two official ones, shall we say, at the end of that. So I just put some questions there. Mailing lists, for example, and I'm not sure it doesn't matter so much, because I suppose because I'm not an engineer, and because perhaps I fall into this desperate bracket of being on the edge of still being considered young enough to be a millennial, just about, I think. I know that I've read a lot of articles that millennials do not like this mailing list approach. It may not factor into our demographic, but it may do in the future. Do we do anything about that? Are we happy with that? I'm just posing the question. I don't necessarily have the answer, and I see from interacting with Pulp users that they are quite used to a mailing list culture that I don't have. And then just one last thing, I have a few more things, but one thing that ties back into the quotes from earlier from the survey is that, there have been several iterations of Pulp. Pulp 3 is the latest and greatest, but oftentimes I've seen it in the survey as well that some of the feedback we're getting, I suspect, is a shift in, we require a shift in perception. So some of the feedback, just say about docs, some of the feedback about finding information is to do with legacy issues, while there has been a huge improvement in both the integrity and reliability of the product and scalability, everything. There's been improvements tenfold, but there's still this perception around Pulp 1 or Pulp 2. And we had someone mention earlier in the week as well, I think it was Grant, that, internally to Red Hat, people tried out Pulp 1 or Pulp 2, and then they're using maybe non-FOSS or other solutions rather than Pulp. And I was just wondering, perhaps around the time, maybe when we go GA with the migration plugin or at some other, I suppose my question is, should we look for opportunities within and outside of Red Hat to improve the perception of Pulp? Because it's a product that's been around a long time. We have to also maybe do something communications-wise about our legacy. So I just put some suggestions there as well. We're attending an OpenShift AMA where Dennis is going to speak about Pulp at that. There are just some other internal ideas there. And then I think that the when we go GA with migration plugin, whenever that happens, that might be a good opportunity to do some open sessions or some interviews where we might be able to just address the history versus everything that we have today. And this the last thing on the communications is the basically the Ruby community, the Home Assistance community. Earlier in this year, they ran like a month-long session where they, instead of just say filing bugs, which can be cumbersome and can take a lot of time, they just opened the floor and asked people to basically do their worst, tell us everything, every gripe that you have, everything that you don't like. They gather, and in this way they kind of opened up feedback. They just tried to turn on the faucets and just let whatever flowed from the community in order to hear like what they don't like. And I was thinking about doing this in the Foreman community, and I just thought I'd put it in here for Pulp as well, because it might be of interest to us for the very fact that we aren't going to be having one-to-one conversations at conferences this year, perhaps not next year. And how do we compensate for that lack of engagement and in a COVID-friendly way? So that was just one suggestion I put there. I am aware that I've spoken for 20 minutes without stop. I'll stop there for now. Have you any questions, any comments so far?
Yes.
Yippee.
I always have comments. From my experience at conferences, when talking to people who maybe they are younger, I don't know what it is, but IRC is definitely a barrier to entry. People do not want to get on IRC to ask questions. Brian and I once ran a workshop where we told people to tell us answers over IRC to their problems, and people are like, what's IRC? And that's when I learned that we're doing it wrong. So yes, I'm all for using Matrix or whatever other avenues for getting people to communicate with us. The other thought about perceptions, maybe we should change our name to a project formerly known as Pulp. I don't know.
It'll be a symbol.
Yeah, it will be a symbol, exactly. Just an orange. But yeah, I don't know about, I think the only way to change perceptions is to do exactly what you said, Melanie, and provide as much exposure to us as possible, which means participating in podcasts or having those articles published in various publications. But really, what I think would really help us is having a UI. Just something that anybody can use, because right now it's just really hard to use Pulp. And if we could have, right now we have a nice video on our homepage of how to use Pulp 2 with the CLI. Having something like that with a UI would, I think, really change perceptions for Pulp 3 and make it really stand out from Pulp 2.
I'd say I deleted that video off the homepage a while ago.
That's okay.
I don't even know.
Okay. We are not trying to tell people about Pulp 2. We're all about Pulp 3. We want people using Pulp 3. So that's okay. But I did like that you could show that video to people and they could tell exactly what they could do with Pulp by watching that video. And right now, we can't really do that for Pulp 3 because we need to show them the REST API and people's eyes just like glaze over. whenever you showed something like that.
Well, we need to start with something, right? I'm in favor of trying different channels like metrics. The concern I have is that if we're going to have too many channels, our attention will spread thin. And I don't know how we would manage that. We could possibly, as Melanie mentioned, try metrics, like be on IRC and metrics for some time, and I don't know, or other means of communication. And if it looks better, we can just switch. However, I would avoid like going back and forth to different communication channels, because I think it's already quite confusing for users to reach us. If we are going to change the channels, I think they will just flip the table. Yeah. I also had a comment. Go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to say, and then go right back to you. The idea, I think, with Matrix is that, just like Kieran's saying in chat, we'll bridge Matrix with these channels. So there will only actually be one channel, no matter where you enter it from, which avoids, and I think that's a smart thing to do, because we want to stay out of the winners and losers area around the chat wars. People are super, is angry the word? Opinionated maybe is the word. About passionate about thank you, about like what's the right channel, and so we can just avoid that problem like altogether and just let Matrix bridge them, and people can just use whatever they want to use. So in fact, what's cool about it is people who like IRC just stay on IRC. People who like Discord or Telegram use that. I interrupted you.
It's okay. And one more remark I had about the Pulp 2 versus Pulp 3. I agree that Pulp 2 has some bad reputation, which complicates our life nowadays. And I think we did some sort of advertisement how Pulp 3 is different from Pulp 2. I didn't realize that people are repelled that much by Pulp 2 and all their memory are about Pulp 2. So maybe we indeed need to make some sort of, give some more, even more attention on highlighting how Pulp 3 is different from Pulp 2. And I have like even a specific example. Like in Pulp 2, the Pulp Docker plugin wasn't designed in the best way. So people who have tried to try it, they said like it's a no way, it's a no go. Now with Pulp Container, I think we're much better set. However, because people have like old memory about things in Pulp 2, they're like, oh, I'm not gonna try this because a couple of years ago it sucked. So I don't know how to do about that and how to change people's perception and opinion, but probably we indeed need to invest more time into this to bring back people who tried Pulp 2 some time ago and give another chance, like convince them to give another chance to Pulp 3.
And there was one question I had, is that of those, just say the Red Hat open source, like the upstream communities that might have tried Pulp 1 or Pulp 2, do we know who they are in order to perhaps join one of their AMAs and talk about Pulp 3, for example?
We definitely have some teams and projects who tried within the company, and we probably should come back to them. And this is what we're gradually doing. Speaking of the community, I think it's hard to track. So I don't have a good answer for that.
If we start with Neil, who talked to us on Monday, who's embedded in the Fedora community. And because I know that some of the folks, when we talk about the Red Hat community that tried Pulp and is actively using other things, it's not just the internal side of Red Hat, it's also all of the larger projects that are that a lot of Red Hat people are involved in, and Fedora is the primary one I'm thinking of. And so Mel, if we get back to Neil, maybe he can point us to the various sub-projects of Fedora that would be ripe for using Pulp, who maybe have decided not to because of experiences they had 5 years ago.
Cool.
And
no, that's
all that sounds wonderful. maybe this is not a great idea, but I think maybe it's time to throw Pulp 2 under the bus a little bit from a marketing perspective. You know, the feedback we're hearing is that people have a perception that it sucked. Just to retell what I'm hearing from the surveys, a very negative perception. And I think in order to address that, we have to probably meet them with language that is similar. Instead, the language that we use now around our Pulp 3 marketing is very much like, Pulp 3 is new and different, and it can still be new and different, and people can still feel really, really negatively about it. So, I don't know.
I mean, it makes sense. Like, we're all people and we have all the reflexes, including the reflex of Pavlov. And the Pulp 2 has been on the market for like 7-8 years, and Pulp 3 is slightly more than a year. So it will indeed it will indeed take some time for people to change their habits and their thinking. So I'm not saying that we're not doing anything wrong. It's just Pulp 2 has been for a really long time. And we need to give some more time to Pulp 3 and more love to Pulp 3.
From a perception perspective, would it be helpful to, based on the surveys where we've had negative impressions of the product, highlight those and give an indication of how those have been addressed in Pulp 3? It's not so much throwing Pulp 2 under the bus, but just taking an open, critical view of where Pulp 2 struggled and suffered, and where it's tried to be addressed in Pulp 3.
Might be a nice idea actually for like an open meeting like this, where we talk through those different points that were brought up. Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
What I was thinking in just listening to all of this is it's almost like if you put your marketing hat on, wanting to do a competitive analysis between you and your competitor, which in this case is Pulp 2 versus Pulp 3, where you have a list of points. Pulp 2 wasn't fast enough, for example, or it took too much disk space, or copying took forever. There's a bunch of things that people have said over the years, and say, this is the problem that you said you had with Pulp 2. Okay, here's how long it takes in Pulp 2, and here's how fast it is in Pulp 3. Here's how much memory it took in Pulp 2. Here's how little memory it takes in Pulp 3. And again, you're not saying, oh, Pulp 2 was terrible, but what you are saying is we listened and we have made improvements in the areas that people have told us were problems.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. So will I continue on to the next section? So this was communication, engagement, perception, and now I think perhaps we should have a discussion around the usability in general, which I think in a way, like I had a section in there about Pulp Installer, but I knew not to put too much time into that because I knew that Fabrizio was going to address everything, and then he did, so it was great. So this, go on.
I just wanted to mention really briefly around the engagement element and the technology that you use to engage. One thing I've noticed working in larger organizations, security is getting more and more belligerent around what you can and can't access, largely due to fear of copying and pasting all of your source code into an IRC channel. Not saying it's a rational fear, but it is what it is. And I struggle both in my current company and my previous company to access a lot of the newer methods of communicating with open source people. So I just want to flag that as a personal concern.
That's great. Can you think of what is safe within those constraints?
Honestly, as simple and old as possible. The newer ones tend to be rejected just because parties haven't yet got technology in place to monitor everything that's going on. So email is fine. IRC is okay so long as you use a web client. I can't use an IRC client, for example. It has to be web IRC to be able, when I'm in the office, to be able to communicate via IRC.
Yeah, I used to work at a different employer until 2016, and I think email was the only way that was allowed at all there.
Yeah.
When you guys say email, does that include things like web forums or just actual sending of email?
Web forums tend to be safe, largely because most companies will now have inline decryption of SSL traffic. So again, it's all around DLP largely, and they're able to see what you are saying and what you're posting and commenting. So that tends to be safe.
Interesting.
Also, I would like to add a comment regarding IRC. Very often people join the channels and they ask questions and they receive a void in response. So maybe with such experience, people actually are not really motivated to interact through the IRC.
That's so from a personal perspective, I associate that with just the number of people that are in there. If you go into Fedora, there's so many more people that it doesn't matter what time zone it is, you're going to get someone responding, whereas Pulp, I believe, is fairly dominated by US contributors. So from a European time zone, and I'm guessing other ones, there may be silence. And you've also got the problem with IRC in that if you log out and log back in again and someone's responded to you, you're not going to get the response. I'm not someone that uses IRC generally. The only reason why I'm using it at the moment is to interact with you guys. But I could imagine a new individual, they're unlikely to be familiar with those nuances. If they're nuances.
And that's one suggestion that I was going to propose, but I don't know would it work. But for example, if I think personally, I believe activity breeds activity. So the more busy a place looks, the busier it gets. Like it's simple human psychology. I have a thing where I'm usually the first into a restaurant because I don't seem to suffer from that problem. So I go sit in a restaurant and then the restaurant fills up, for example, because there's somebody in there already. It's not as intimidating to go in there. And I think that it can be similar for these IRC rooms, that there's nothing going on in there. So it feels a little silly to be the first one to post in there. So I was going to suggest that we even eliminate the Pulp one or eliminate Pulp Dev, and all Pulp conversation takes place in one, because it's not that busy. But then if it did get busy, that might be quite painful for all the different threading of conversations. But I do see, for example, amongst yourselves, you're often having several different conversations and just atting the person that you're speaking to. But I also think that it's not a full-time job to support Pulp users and at a service level of immediate. So I think it's a bit of I don't particularly think it's an effective way of communication, IRC in general. I find it noisy, but then again, we probably can't afford to not have it. So I find it's a bit, the quietness of the Pulp channel, I think, is causing quietness. But then do we want to breed an enormous amount of noisiness? And yeah, I find there's something there that I think we need to figure out.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Tanya.
I wanted to say that that's interesting, because there was a point when we said, we're worried to lose messages from users while we're actively discussing something. and we have a lot of development related conversations which they are not interested in. Let's create a separate channel. So we used to have one channel, but then we decided not to.
So there were people posting amongst you.
I imagine it's like an active time, and we have a lot of discussion, and it's very easy for some user requests to get lost at this point, because they don't tag anyone, and they just post the question, and we're like in the middle of some discussion, and
What I like about having the user facing channel is that whenever I get online and I see that there is activity there, my client just stays signed on. I go look in the channel, and it's easy for me to see that Douglas had asked a question 4 hours earlier, and I can get back to him right then. If there was a whole lot of activity, it would be really hard for me to see that there was a question like some while ago.
And the key is the question from someone like not actively working on Pulp, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Because
someone once again, or nudge someone one more time, and it's not a problem. But we try not to lose user requests.
So I think the key there is if you're looking for, if someone's looking for support and they go onto a channel, unless there are active people on the channel that can always respond to the support request, you probably don't want non-support traffic in there, because that request will get lost. I know for me personally, again, because of the time zone difference, I'll ask a question and it will be the next day that I log in to look for an answer. And if there's been a massive amount of communication, it will be a struggle to go all the way back and see that information and see that response. If someone was able to respond within half an hour before I go home and I can work through it, then fine. But till we had that level of support, which is unlikely, call me a pessimist, I wouldn't have thought we'd want other more verbose communication in there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely looking forward to a day when we have users helping users, and that definitely happens now, very rarely, but I remember before Pulp 3, with Pulp 2, we had a user, Kodiak Firesmith, who is a heavy Pulp 2 user, and he would be answering questions about Pulp 2 in there, and that was great. And I'm hoping that we get a wide enough adoption of Pulp 3 that we're going to get back into that, where we have users that are not developers helping other users.
And I think that that's very possible, because one of the main issues that I'm even surprised we had folks like Kodiak, to be honest, because one of the barriers to users helping users is users having an understanding about what's going on. And so many times in Pulp 2, the answer was, well, what's going on? And the answer is, I have no idea. And so hopefully by having software that produces more repeatable outcomes and is simpler, that the user helping user vision will be realized. I really believe that's possible with Pulp 3.
The tension that we're talking about in terms of the chat clients and the IRC, the classic IRC thing of there's too many people, so we split up into 6 different channels and now they're all dead, has been going on for years. I don't have a good answer for that. The real problem that I see with IRC, and I say this as someone who's used IRC since it was the new hotness a long time ago, and I'm very cynical about whatever chat client everybody wants to use this 18-month period. But the real problem that IRC has is, unless you are a fairly expert IRC user and have done what Dennis and Brian, let's say, have done, and you've got your own bridge somewhere that's always on that you connect to, then there's these gaps. When you're not connected, you lose whatever happened. And you don't know when somebody answered you, or you don't know if somebody asked a question because it never hit your client. And it's really hard to address a community when you've got those gaps. And if we had 100 people that were evenly spread around the world, there would be fewer of those, but they would still happen occasionally. If we move to to an approach like we've been talking about both verbally and in the chat here, of having a central matrix that bridges to our current communication channels, then that would alleviate the gap, because I think Matrix would be tracking would let you see the stuff that happened when you weren't actively logged into the channel. Let me ask, if somebody's used Matrix, is that correct, or am I lying? Okay, Kieran says yes. Okay, cool. So one benefit of doing that, even if we changed nothing else, is we'd be able to close those "I'm not currently connected" holes. And if we advertise the Matrix connectivity as the way to get to us, then users would also be closing those holes. And we wouldn't have to change any of our actual, we're still talking in IRC as long as it's bridged through Matrix. That would help. The larger how many channels should we have discussion, I don't know what the right answer is, because we are where we are today to address a problem, a real live problem that we wanted to solve. And I don't know that I have a better answer than where we are right now, but it feels like we could get there kind of stepwise. We could improve the way that users interact with us in a way that doesn't leave those gaps, and then slowly figure out how to do things, better and better as we move on, and have an evolutionary approach, as opposed to we're just going to switch everything that we're doing to some different thing that is the new hotness.
I have 5 minutes to go through a bazillion other points that I probably won't get to, but I will try to some extent. Just give me a sec. I share my screen again. Can you see?
Yes.
Excellent. So that's just for communication, what we've talked about so far. And in terms of the project itself and the project's usability, we had a session today about installation, so I just cut out anything that's related to installation, because I think it's known, it's obvious, and I suppose that there will be some action items that we will take to simplify the user experience there. I will just use the next 4 minutes maybe to talk about documentation. And I think, I've been working in documentation since I got out of college, and enterprise level documentation, API documentation. I look at your docs and I think that you've put a lot of work into your docs. I think that as developers of a project, they're fairly well documented. There's a lot of conceptual information in there. From the survey, 58.8% of users reported finding it difficult to find information about Pulp. You have to factor into that some of these users are Pulp 2 users, and I do suspect that from their comments that some of them may not have looked at Pulp 3 docs. I don't have a great familiarity with Pulp 2 docs, if I'm honest, but I think that, again, we have to weigh this a little bit with perception rather than the current state of affairs. So, and I took this from just one comment to illustrate these points, but the Pulp 1 version docs are still available, but totally different from Pulp 2 docs. No response from mailing lists, lack of real-world examples, unhelpful error messages. I'm not really sure from this, just say which. Yeah, well, actually, I can check that. If I go back, I can check whether they have used Pulp 3 or Pulp 2. So if I write up a proper summary of the survey results, I'll be able to dig into that a bit deeper. But in terms of error messages, because I'm not using the product necessarily, I'm not aware of the error messages, but that's definitely an area that I can 100% help with. I used to write too many of them when I worked in IBM, because IBM was incredibly focused on reducing its support costs, and actionable error messages that help the user get out of the situation that they got into to throw the error is something that has been proven to liberate users from having to go and seek help and allow a certain level of independence. So if anyone is writing error messages or anyone wants me to review error messages, I'm very happy to do that. And earlier in the week, we kind of talked about this issue of real world examples. So our workflows, for example, show you how to set up how to order the APIs in order to match the specific low-level workflow of the plugin. But in terms of real-world examples, I'm curious how we will go about understanding what are the higher-level problems that people are solving in the community with Pulp, and how we can then serve them in our docs, even on a high level, even just to give context. I think that's something that might be quite useful. This comment about documentation sometimes is difficult to find for the required plugin. There's an active effort, to consolidate that. So I think that this is something, it's been reported when we have occasional audits or annual audits. That's something that was brought up several times as well, but it's in progress now, so we can largely strike that off. Someone wrote, for me, it was hard to get started with the shell script, and HTTP IE stuff could be easier for newbies. API talks are too vague in places. String does not tell me if there are character restrictions. So yeah. And then just one thing, I suppose I added in about topic-based writing, as you were speaking in the previous, as Mike was speaking in the previous section about man pages. But how do we measure whether our docs are serving the users? So if there's incorrect information, users will raise an issue. But for example, with Red Hat documentation, like with the enterprise level Red Hat documentation, they have this plugin that they have implemented where a user can literally, well, since I left Satellite, they've disabled it because well, basically you can highlight the text, right click, and leave a comment saying, no, this is wrong, this is unclear. And we were getting a lot of really useful feedback through this. And I was wondering, should we, for example, create a Google form that we could put into the docs? So there's something that's not an error, but something, a general user engagement opportunity was, did you get to where you wanted to go to with these docs? What worked, what didn't work, and leave it maybe permanently linked in there for someone to just give us feedback that's not necessarily something that needs to be put into a sprint, but something that might help us shape how we do docs. And then in terms of what you were talking about in the earlier session with the installation, most large enterprise level documentation efforts that I know of. So I've worked for three large American companies at this stage. I have friends that I graduated with that are working in other companies like SAP and places like this. And there's a general approach to documentation where it's almost like object-oriented programming. You have separate files, and per file you create an action-based item. Then in another file, you would have your conceptual information defined, and then you would have references like tables, indexes, things like this that's useful for advanced users who already are maybe configured and keep going back. If that's something you're interested in, we can talk about that at another time. Yeah, so these points I've kind of addressed. I think the documentation is sound from someone who has looked at a lot of documentation, too much documentation for a lifetime maybe. I think the documentation is sound, but perhaps we might need to just shift our thinking, or add more context, or perhaps look at how we can get more users to give us feedback on that. And I'm over time, I see now. I'm going to end really, really fast. But basically, from the survey, all Pulp 2 users, they expressed a desire to have Pulp 3 CLI. 50% of Pulp 2 users cited it as a blocker. 44% of Pulp 3 users cited no CLI, as adding as a difficulty to using Pulp 3, and 70% of the users asked on the survey said that they did not need a web UI, which is a little bit controversial, but I just said I'd throw it in there. And that's all from me, I think.
That's cool. I have a quick question. Did you get a feel for like, so CLI versus web UI, did you get a feel for like whether Pulp 2 was motivating that perception that we need a CLI in Pulp 3 or not?
All Pulp 2 users reported that they needed a CLI. Not all, less than half of Pulp 3 users reported that they needed a CLI. So I suppose that might answer the question. Yeah.
Okay, and I imagine, so like for the web UI, did the Pulp 2 users say that they didn't need one, I guess?
I'm going to dig into that. So that 70% of all users said that they didn't need a web UI, but I'm going to write up, once it's actually closed, I'm going to write up a proper report on this, and I'll dig into that exact question, David.
Okay, cool. Because yeah, I'm working on both of those, so I'm just kind of curious, I guess.
Yeah, and one of the questions I have as well about the UI statistic, perhaps because I have the belief that Pulp absolutely does need a web UI, is that we're pulling users who are Pulp users. So these users have already accepted the complexity of Pulp. And what we can't know, or I don't know how to assess, is what would the question answer be if we asked every user who considered using Pulp? Because I actually believe that we're turning away perhaps even a majority of users. And that number could be like 90% of users want a web UI because of the demographics of the segment of the user population that we're actually receiving responses from.
Yeah, so the software that would compete with Artifactory and Nexus both have UIs, and I believe those users would say that they want a UI.
Exactly. And also, as we talk about growing the community and how do we get to the naive user in the first place, a UI makes that a lot easier. And just to, I want to address Douglas, who specifically said, I really need the REST API, and I don't care about the UI or the CLI. The idea here is building on top of that existing foundation, not replacing that foundation. That everything at the end of the day is going to focus into the same code that's issuing the same commands. It's just how do we make it more accessible? But this is the classic survey problem of you're only going to get responses from people that are motivated to give you responses. And you're not going to get the people who looked at your thing and said, yeah, screw that. I'm never going to use Pulp. They're not going to respond to the survey either.
I'm very aware of, first of all, I agree with you completely. I'm just, I just wanted to just throw spanners, I suppose, as one does at the very end. I'm aware Tanya's session, you only have a few minutes to have a bit of a break. If you want to follow up on, Brian, I'm not sure if this was what you were hoping for, but yeah, if you want to follow up on anything, we can, I suppose, and we should probably end.
Yes, let's end the recording. This was absolutely wonderful. Really, really great. Let's quit. I'm gonna quit the thing here.
Yeah, I just want to mention on Friday there was a session for both the UI and the CLI.
Please come.
Very cool. Thanks, Mel.
Yeah, hell great. I just ended the recording, so we can take a short break. Thank you so much, Melanie.
No bother.
See you guys in 3 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you. Oh my god, that brown bag.
Fabrizio, can you see my screen?
Yes, Tani.
Thank you. What do you see?
Relative path problem.
Okay, good.
I'm going to drop off Tanya at some point in this, but I look forward to the recording. I'll watch it soon.
No worries.
You look forward.
It's kind of more
The
technical
hats.
details. So. Nice hat, Matthias.
Thank you.
I found that I have only like tons of different kids caps at my place. I don't have anything interesting left.
Yeah, I'm with my parents at the moment, so there's quite a fondness.
Brian, that's awesome.
Nice. I found my foreman cap.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
How old is it?
It's only like a year or two old. I got it at Summit, I think, last year.
That was 2 years ago, I think.
Oh, okay.
Or actually, I don't know. You went 2 years in a row.
Yeah, I think it was last year with Daniel, maybe.
Okay.
So I'll wait a bit till folks are back. Or at the very least, I would like Daniel to be here since we
I'm here.
worked basically together. Okay, great.
I'm eating.
No
Let's
worries.
hit the record button. Are we ready to start?
Yeah, maybe we can start. Should I hit? I can probably hit the record button. Yeah. So tell me if you don't want to be recorded. All right, it seems like it started. Okay, so my name is Tanya Tereshenko, and well, mostly Daniel and I worked recently, and we're trying to find the solution for the what we call relative path problem. I hope that we can have a discussion and maybe brainstorm some ideas. But before that, I'll try to explain what the problem is, what we're trying to achieve, and out of all the ideas we considered, which ones are potentially valid. So the use cases we're trying to cover is like there is one generic use case. As a user, I can publish the same content in different repositories and the different relative paths. Currently, it's not possible to do that. Like Pulp core doesn't provide this functionality, and some plugins this problem themselves. And the one specific, or I would say sub-use case of it is that as a user, I can mirror a repository fully, including its metadata. And so Pulp doesn't recreate it. So maybe the use cases explain the problem already, but to go a little bit into more detail, that if we look at the schema here. Can you see it properly on my screen? Okay. So currently we have relative path tied to content artifact. Can you see my cursor when I'm moving it? Not really.
Yes.
You can. Great.
It's small, but yeah.
So relative path is currently tied to content artifact. So if we have, if we would like to publish the same content but under different paths, we can't do that at the moment. At the same time, we have relative path also in published artifact. It's in the top right corner. And we also have relative path in published metadata. And I think currently it's most of the time, well, plugins decide how they use it, but most of the time it's taken from content artifact or from some information about content. So currently we have like relative path in 3 places. Or you can say 2, because like published metadata and published artifacts serve a little bit different purpose. All right. Anyone wants to add anything to the use cases of the problem statement? Or any questions so far? All right. So we discussed multiple solutions, and one of the ways is how Pulp Debian and Pulp file are doing it. So the relative path becomes a part of the content unit. It's kind of half solution because, in my opinion, it's half solution because it creates a lot of redundant data. But it is a way to address the problem of publishing same content in multiple repositories. So pros for this approach: that there is no changes needed in Pulp core. Plugins are fully in control of it, and it's relatively easy to implement. The downsides are that, as I stated, the every content can be duplicated. This doesn't help for multi-artifact content. And I think it's very confusing for users when they look at the list of the content and they search for it using like their natural, like semantic key, if you want some kind of name or version, and they want to copy this content, they will see multiple instances of them, which will be different only in their relative paths. So that's a solution 1, and it will cover the metadata mirroring. For example, if we have it as a special content unit. Any questions or additions to this part?
I just want to add, this approach does not deduplicate the content, but still the artifacts are unique. So it's not a concern in the disk space needed, just in the database, and especially in the content table. But yes, that is a problem.
Yes, thank you. That's important addition to it. All right. So the other proposal is to have additive changes to the current model to the current design. So existing data models will be the same, and we can add a new model, which will basically connect repository content and content artifact and state the relative path associated with it. Maybe I can show you in a graphic way. So if you look the left top rectangle, this is the new edition, which connects content artifact and repository content. So the benefit of this approach, that in comparison to previous one, it handles multi-artifact content, and there is no duplication on the content level. The downside is that relative path is now like in one more place. There is, I think our queries potentially become even more complicated because we add one more table to this core part, and a lot of changes will be needed in stages, in like basically everywhere. And additional question is with some REST API changes, like how you copy such content. Do you need to specify every time relative path? So there are many questions around that. Any questions to this approach, or was it clear?
Tanya, if we did, does this approach relative path field in its existing place in addition, or does it remove relative path from where it lives currently and is completely replaced by the mapping table?
No, this is like, it's called like additive changes only. It doesn't remove it from the existing place.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
current use case of the existing relative path is somewhat, I think in all our plugins, it's used as a file name.
Right.
So I don't know, yeah, and we will mention it later. So I keep thinking about it as a file name, and we discussed that it probably makes sense to rename this field to file name.
I get it.
So, but it's still, relative path is still in published artifact and metadata, but also here. And we kind of carry our relative path in content artifact is for publications. So, and this brings me to the next proposal, but
yeah, before
I will stop for a second and ask if there is. Yeah, Matthias, go ahead.
You said it's only an additive change in the database, but surely there must be some code change that the newly introduced relative path is used somewhere, and it's not clear to me how that is being used.
How the newly relative path will be used?
Yes.
Okay, so the relative path will be used for publications. The old relative path just carries the file name or whatever it used to be. But here you can configure it per repo because there is association with repo content. So for this repo, this content artifact will have this relative path. And for the other repo, it will have another. I guess it's under discussion if we want to remove the other one completely.
Well, I think you want to keep it so that whenever you are displaying content outside of the repository context, that you have a file name to show.
Right, I agree. I also keep thinking about upload case. You know, when you upload and you don't upload it directly to a repository.
Yep.
But just upload to Pulp, you kind of need to know some file name.
Yeah. And as far as the copy APIs, I believe that, it can always default to the relative path that it's at. If it's being copied from a repository to another repository, the default is the path that it's at in the source repository, with an option to specify a new path in the destination.
And I think it's a whole can of worms, which we probably can discuss. But what if when you copy like many content units?
Yeah.
Like, do you specify for every single a mapping
and
optional mapping?
And another thing, Dennis. So the only plugin that has a copy API that actually works that way is the RPM plugin. Like our general copy API is just adding and removing content units to a specific repository, and we'd have to find some way to say, okay, but where?
Yeah.
So yes, Dennis.
I was just gonna say, we would have to get really creative for this to not be a backwards and compatible change. Because the most straightforward thing to do in that case, Daniel, is to change the interface for that modify endpoint, where it's what it is now.
Yeah, so I suggest, like right now, not to go that deep into copy details, because I think it's if we solve this problem in some kind of a generic way, and we're able to have multiple relative paths and not duplicate content, this question with copy we need to solve anyway. So regardless of proposals. So I would like to move to the last one. There are 3 or like almost 4. Like third one has 2 options. Just while you keep in mind what we had before to go more into detail. So the last one is what I called it relative path in published artifact only. It's a kind of completely different approach, which Daniel brought up. And the idea is, so there are 2 versions, like simple version and more complicated version. But I think the main idea is that we don't create any new models, and at sync time or any kind of content addition time, you create a publication and you create published artifacts and metadata at sync time. You can create published metadata at sync time for the mirrored metadata repositories, and you can create an incomplete publication with published artifacts only for any other repositories, and finish publication and generate metadata when you publish it.
So I would say that second bit is part of the generalized version. So this particular simple version is just for the RPM.
Yeah, so I just wanted to give a general idea, and the simple part of it is to have it for mirrored repositories only. Like, so you just create published artifacts and publish metadata right when you sync, and that's it, because you can't
Yeah,
change
you're not
it.
generating anything. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so this approach, I think it avoids many problems and doesn't create new relative paths, more relative paths in our database.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So we're talking about doing auto publish like last week and this week, I guess, a little bit too. Would it be okay maybe to tell users that in this case, like if you want to mirror metadata, then you have to do auto publish, and so you sync and publish at the same time, and that's like the only way you can like really get a publication when you're using mirror option?
So in a general sense that's happening, but in a literal sense, it's literally doing the publishing in the sync task.
Right.
Well, the publishing is going to happen in the sync task also when we are talking about, and it will be up to each plugin to implement how the logic occurs. And what I think you're saying, David, makes sense. And that's exactly what's being proposed here, is that this is all happening in a single task. And the publication will be another created resource that gets created as part of that task.
I guess the only use case though is if somebody wants to republish. Like, are there options during publish in RPM that where a user might need to republish one of these repositories?
Well, for the mirrored, it's just pure mirror. So it's not configurable in any way. You just take what is in the remote. But if it's not mirrored metadata, then in the more complicated generalized version of this proposal, you create incomplete version of publication at sync time with published artifacts only. You don't create metadata. So metadata will still be created when you create publication, and all the configuration would be taken into account then. Just artifacts, published artifacts already will be created, and they will have a proper whatever it's preferred.
So if I add, let's say an RPM, the second publish will create published artifact only for that added RPM.
Well, published artifacts are actually tied to a specific publication. So I think...
So it will recreate everything.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, it will create a new publication, I would expect. Just incomplete one with this newly added content.
Tanya, can you please elaborate? I probably missed the point. What is the benefit of creating published artifacts at the sync time? Because apparently, if I upload one more content, it will be overridden.
Yes, it sounds a bit like the verbatim publication we heard yesterday. So the moment you sync it, you just create the mirrored publication automatically. And then when you add content, you do the usual publications we already have.
Yeah.
So that would be a different kind of publication even. Maybe in a different data model.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. But what I have the same question Ina has, I think. Well, at least I think I do. Why does it have to happen as one step? Why couldn't it be separated into two separate actions performed at different times?
So the reason is because like the entire relative path problem is basically we have to store this relative path data somewhere in order to maintain. So at sync time, we know this information because we have the original metadata. So if we have sync and publish as two different steps, then we have to store it somewhere in Pulp so that publish can do something with it. But if we don't have two separate steps, then we don't need to store that information anywhere. We can just save it directly.
And really, we don't need to have two separate steps because there is no need to generate metadata. And the whole purpose of is to generate metadata. So from a workflow this perspective, this makes sense that it would all happen at once.
I agree. I agree to the extent, the answer to that is correct to the extent that the relative path problem is the same as the verbatim problem. And I don't know what the answer to that is. Like, if we never did verbatim, and one of the ways I dig into that is if we never did verbatim stuff, which I'm sure is not the case, but let's just for thought experiment say we did, would we still have a motivation to solve the relative path problem?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yeah.
Don't we have an example in the wild of repos that have the same artifact in different paths in the same repo?
Yes.
Not in the same repo. It's not necessarily the same repo. It's the same artifact in any repo in Pulp, which causes problems right now.
And it's when the location matters, right? Like in a lot of cases, the location doesn't matter, but there are specialized cases where it does.
Like
Right,
currently we did it with product ID.
Yes.
Right.
Multiple times for relate for base OS and for AppStream.
Yeah, but it's where location matters, because as like a counterpoint, like Pulp Ansible, location doesn't matter. It's just we generate the file name based on like the namespace name and version. So.
And in Pulp file, the location is everything that matters, and therefore it has a relative path in its own content.
Right.
Yep.
And I think that's a valid assumption.
Right.
And so every content type has a relative path because it wants to verbatim publish it.
Yeah, so I think there's definitely a use case for a user to be able to change the directory structure of a repository or a publication, really. They want to, I don't know, maybe it's a contrived example, but combining repositories where a repo has multiple repos in it. And I think this is kind of like in Debian, this happens, where packages may be repeated in multiple releases, I guess.
Yes, but then they are shared in the same pool directory. They are just referenced in several metadata.
Okay.
So in a way, the Debian repository structure solves one of the problem Pulp solves too. The deduplication of packages.
Okay. Yeah, I've always thought of pools as our artifacts, essentially. Is that a fair comparison, Matthias?
Yes. Just the pool structure is structured by the name of the package and not by its SSH something.
So another example is that CentOS tool, some ops tools repository, which has multiple directions, I guess, who are managed by different teams, and some of the packages are the same, but they are under different paths, and they are in one repository.
Yeah, I think that's the one I was thinking of, Tanya, because that's the one that bit us most recently.
Yeah, and it's not very common, but create repo C and like RPM, it's allowed basically in RPM repository. Justin, I feel like you wanted to ask something, no?
Nope.
Okay.
So, I'm not sure if it's a proposal that's on here, and maybe this is like way too late in the game to even think about new ideas, but a lot of these proposals, I think, first off, are really great and really well thought out. Probably better than the idea I'm going to say here. But they all have this one thing in common, which is that they're still assuming that we're going to keep a single content unit. And I'm just wondering if this problem gets easier if we accept as a constraint that when a content unit has the same artifacts and laid out in a different file path, that it's just a different content unit.
I think that's the first proposal.
Is that the first proposal?
Yeah, so that's the first one. This is how Debian does it. My personal main concern about it. So first of all, it doesn't cover the multiple artifacts case. So you can change your path for content. I don't know. Yeah, but which has only one artifact in it. But I guess current example is only distribution tree, and we can live with that. But from the user perspective, sorry, Matthias?
Sorry to interrupt you there. In the Debian, there is one metadata content that consists of 3 files usually, which is release GPG, and release or in release. And they kind of share the same location because they must lie in the same directory, and so they use only one of those relative paths there. So I think for content that has this assumption that my number of n artifacts are laid out in a certain relative order, it solves it kind of.
Okay. So my main confusion about this approach, apart from having this duplication in content, is this user experience with looking at the content they have. And I don't know how to gauge how big the problem is. And if I have a big installation and I posted it under different relative paths, I will see like 10 same RPMs, which will be different by relative path. So, and I will need to choose which one to copy, right? So we will need to, I don't know, Catella will need to add to their web UI relative path, or I don't know, or just pick any random one.
Well, and like the way we do applicability, we base it off like, one package. So it's the same problem we have with errata, where Pulp has this idea that, the same erratum are actually multiple erratum, and we have to join them together in our database to present something that makes sense to the user. And it's kind of a pain if we have to do it with every content type, or even with RPMs, it would be even more of a pain, I think.
Yeah, I wanted to say 2 things actually, which is why I joined. I was only in the stream before. So one thing to this question, like, do you get the same artifact in different places in the same repository or different repositories? One of the cases I've come across that's actually pretty common in the Debian case is like empty files. So Debian repositories upstream when in metadata often have empty files. So that's all one artifact because it's just the empty file and it's all over the place. That's just one concrete example. And the other thing I was going to say to Tatiana's point is that, so we in the Pulp Debian plugin, we have all of these different like metadata content types. And it is confusing, I think, for users like to understand what those are actually used for, also because they're not used in all of the publications. So a lot of the metadata content types are only used by the verbatim publisher. or a lot of content types that we have in the plugin that are synced during sync are only used by the verbatim publisher, and the other publisher just ignores them because it generates its own metadata, which is difficult to explain or grok or yeah. So I've tried to compensate a bit by writing documentation saying very clearly, like, yeah, this is going to use this and this is going to use that, but are people going to read it?
So Brian, do you have any major concerns about the last proposal, Daniel's proposal, with creating publication, either incomplete or complete if it's a mirrored case, at sync time? I mean, I personally, for whatever reason, I tried to keep the sync and publish very isolated in my head. And my first reaction was like, no, they're so tied together. And then I was thinking, well, actually, we store this relative path for the sake of publication. And right now, it makes it more explicitly tied. They were always kind of dependent on each other anyway. Yeah. Do you have any concerns about, or any of you? Brian brought up the Debian way of solving the problem. So I'm interested in any concerns for the more generalized solutions.
Hey, just to confirm, this won't work for plugins that don't have publications, right?
Yeah, and this was kind of I can understand being asked about this because this is one of my concerns early on, and it's not listed on a con, and I was going to say that, but yeah, it's not a kind of, it feels like a not complete solution, but I don't know. I mean, like, I don't know if that's actually means that we shouldn't do it.
I have a quick comment.
Yep, sure.
So I think that this, and I think I wrote it somewhere, but we edited multiple times, so maybe it got lost. I think this needed only for plugins which use publications, because how will you configure different relative paths when you directly distribute it? So it is for the plugins which have publications.
Well, I mean, I agree with you. And in thinking about this, and I have been thinking about this, I think it would be a better trade to accept a smaller change, which is, I think, proposal 3, either version of it. It's a better trade to accept a smaller change that addresses use cases that we know we have than it is to take on a much more invasive change, both in user experience outcomes and implementation, to account for use cases that we don't yet have. And so I suspect that we're going to have those things at some point. Like, for example, almost like the empty file problem, only now just part of a multi-content artifact that just doesn't use publications. And you go to sync 2 repositories and the same content has the same artifact and they're just in different places, and Pulp just won't be able to handle that. But, you know, on that day, maybe we'll just end up having another follow-on conversation with more concrete examples at that time. And perhaps I'm fine with that.
So I think we already have this problem, the example with product ID in multiple repositories. Like, one is the same file and the path matters.
Yeah, but the difference is that RPM, which tracks that content type, uses publications. And what I'm saying is that there may come along content types which do not use publications and have that same problem. And so when we say the solution isn't complete, and that's specifically what I mean, is that this works if all we did was have content types that use publications, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. I think we would have been drawn that direction straight away. The lingering concern is, what do we do when other content types that don't use publications, like what do they do? And the answer is, we don't know.
Pulp 4.
Yeah, I mean, like, we just don't have a good answer for that, and I'm okay with that. Because what I like about Proposal 3 is that it's very non-invasive, and perhaps that's not the right characterization as I'm seeing on the chat reel here. But relative to the, yeah, I mean, you're right. But relative to the other options, I see it as much less invasive.
For the user, it's less invasive, for sure.
Yeah. Totally. And I really think that when we make the relative path be part of the repository version, and being able to specify that, our REST API will really need to account for that. And I think that will, in order to make that usable and just not cumbersome, we will need to make backwards incompatible changes to our REST API.
But just to call out, I mean, I'm talking literally out of both sides of my mouth. It's a bug fix, and a serious one at that. Therefore, those could happen in Pulp 3. And in fact, we could enable 2 modes and carry them, and you could flip the mode depending on which one you want to allow for transition time. There's so much that we could do to make that okay.
And I can also say that this change in the REST API would be for every plugin, and each plugin could rev its version. Not necessarily Pulp Core.
Well, I'll have to send many nice gifts to Justin, because I'm pretty sure that what I just said is really practically would be a major problem for Chitello.
I have a question. I'm just trying to see if I properly understood option 3. So during the sync, I download a file. I turn it into an artifact that's exactly as it is now. And then I, at the same point, also create a published artifact for it with a relative path.
That's right. We would add another stage, basically, that would do that, I think.
Okay. And then my question is, okay, so that's then all done. Sync is done. And now I create an actual publication, so with additional metadata or whatever it is. How does that use the previously created published artifacts or not use them? That thing I'm a bit
it does not
fuzzy
use
on.
them.
So my proposal is basically the entire publication, metadata, and artifact for a mirrored repository, and specifically for mirrored repositories, would be created at sync time, and publish time would do nothing. And maybe we could make it so that if you hit that endpoint, you'll just get back the one that already existed, so that it wouldn't, change the workflow that much. But basically, this would be nothing would actually happen at publish time. It would all happen for mirrored repositories.
And for non-mirrored repositories, nothing would change at publish time. It would still create a new published artifact for every artifact it wants to include.
Nothing at all would change for non-mirrored repositories.
And is that,
I don't see why we need to distinguish the repository to be mirrored or not.
The repository version needs to be.
On every sync, we just emit one verbatim publish of that sync. And then we have the chance to publish that repository in the old way, again, after maybe adding content to it. Then we would have both. And we would even get rid of one of the problems mentioned on Monday, that when I add content and then do a verbatim publish, that's unsensical.
But don't like my normal publications need access to the relative path and now no longer have it because it's no longer in the artifact?
It would stay. It would stay there. Nothing would actually change. We wouldn't remove it from content artifact.
Right. I found the bug in my thinking.
Yeah. So, but what I go ahead.
I have a quick question. So how does this solve the problem where you have an artifact in two different locations in two different repositories, or does it not?
Exactly.
So it would solve it by you just create two different published artifacts, and you'd still have the one content going through the content pipeline. You just save two different published artifacts.
Yeah, and I guess what
But we're not going to publish artifacts for non-mirrored repos, right?
Exactly. This only works for mirrored repos, right?
The simple one that is non-invasive, yes. If we don't want to be invasive with the changes we want to make to our API and just how everything works, then yes, this is opt-in pretty much just for mirrored repositories. And to generalize it later, but that involves a much larger set of changes.
And I think that's generally an okay thing. I mean, I'm usually the one, or historically in this conversation, have been the advocate for a comprehensive, complete solution. But I think the reality is that no matter what proposal we go for, if it's the more invasive, complete option, it brings with it an unavoidable complexity. And it's not, it's the right, the API would have to get more complicated. How much more complicated? Just enough to address the complexity that our data models are now tracking. Is that worth it? Is it needed? That's a tough question to answer. I won't. But we could do the non-invasive option, and that would bring some value to resolve the problem in many situations. And I think the question is there a practical, we got to do better than that, and we know that we have to do better than that now.
What were the use cases that needed the same artifact published in different locations and different repositories?
Well, the use case is the product ID. And we saw
one
that
was
by
the product ID. Yeah, one was the product ID, and another one was one of the CentOS repositories, which have the same files under different directories. They have the whole structure, like directory structure in the upstream repository. It's not just the packages, just like in alphabetical order. They had meaningful directories in their RPM repository, and some of them were duplicated.
And let me ask this about that specific case. Is it important that when we go to publish it, we retain that?
No. Well, we have no option. We can't even publish such repository because it contains two things.
It contains duplicate packages. Is that what you're saying, basically?
Yes.
Yeah, under different directories. The same package lives in different directories.
Yeah,
and it gets more common once you have metadata files as well, and not just packages as artifacts.
I think that's really the crux of
I said,
the problem.
Then you have the empty metadata file, which is all over the place.
Which would go away with the option 3, where you just emit the verbatim publish on sync and don't save the metadata anywhere else.
For a mirror, but to address the problem generally, you'd have to go further.
What I see here is that every repository is always mirroring on sync and published later.
Yes.
Well, no, it can't be mirrored all the time. Like, what if you have additive mode? You can't mirror. I don't know. Your metadata would be different from the content of repository.
Yes, but the moment you sync the repository, it would create a mirrored publication from that. immediately. And then you can add content. Then that will not immediately create a publication because you can add a lot more content.
Yep.
And then you would publish it in the old way.
But once you copy some content in, then you have to worry about, I mean, you can't just automatically create the publication on the copy. The same
you wouldn't.
You wouldn't.
It's just
Yeah,
automatically
yeah.
on the sync, because you know when you sync, there's something upstream that is a valid repository.
Guys, sorry to interrupt you. So we are already over time. I'm very glad that discussion isn't going, because it means that the problem is understood and we're trying to find solutions and discuss them in different ways. I suggest that we continue it, I don't know, on mailing list or somewhere. Or else what I hear is that the third option seems to be good, and preferably we want to have the least invasive version, and we need to figure out if it's enough for now, or we need or we need to make it, I don't know, take a more complicated approach. All right, guys, thank you very much. Justin, are you talking to us or not?
No, sorry if my lips
Okay.
are moving.
Okay. All right, thank you very much, guys. Thank you very much for the discussion, and see you in, and I'll stop the recording.
I do still have one more question, if somebody's still here.
Yeah.
Sure.
Do I understand the invasive version of option 3 correctly? And that's so I sync things and I create all my published artifacts. And is it then that when I create a normal publication, it would get access to those published artifacts somehow to retrieve relative path, or is it, or did I not understand that?
The way I think about it is, let's take, for example, the empty file, the empty metadata file. You've got it published in multiple places. So as part of under the invasive plan, we'd have published artifacts as kind of part of the repository version almost. Not literally, but conceptually. And you'd have, if you were to copy it, you would copy we'd have to involve published artifacts with the copy. So you'd copy the content unit and all of the locations where it's published, or where it's going to be published.
Okay. So that's basically a bit like in the simple case of option 3, the sort of automated or the extra published artifacts are tied to the sync only, and in the complex version they're tied to each repository version.
Yeah, which means that which is really complicated, because you have to create an incomplete publication, because published artifacts are tied to a publication. And so there will be always this incomplete publication that's associated with every repository version.
And then you create a complete publication taking a repository version and an incomplete publication as its input.
Well, there is a relation. So you have you can take your incomplete publication from repository version and create metadata and complete it.
Yeah, that's what I guess I meant.
Yeah, you'd still just use the repository version as the source, but we'd go and look up publications we can.
Yeah, so I mean internally, so not the user, but like internally, the user says, give me this repository version and create a publication from it, and internally would say, okay, what incomplete publication is tied up with this version, and now I'm going to take that and complete it.
Probably the easiest case to think about this is the file plugin. So the file plugin You know, we have, you can have a directory structure in the file plugin, and the only thing you're really doing at publish time under this generalized approach is making the manifest, because all the publish artifacts are already there.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. And then the difficulty in more complex cases becomes ensuring you actually end up with a valid state from like the stuff you already have and the stuff you're going to create on the fly, and making sure those fit together.
Oh yeah, exactly.
I definitely don't like the more invasive version of.
I actually like it.
At publish time, every content unit would know where to go. And if that means that when we publish a RPM repository, it has the structure Pulp gives it, and if that's an option, then I would say that's the way we should go. While still having the mirrored thing.
I mean, I kind of like option 3, but I think there's a significant risk I'm missing something that will be really horrible in practice.
I think it looks scarier than it seems, to be honest. Justin, it's awesome.
Absolutely.
That's the optimistic version.
I thought I'm supposed to
feel like
all be afraid.
Yeah, either
Go ahead.
or 3 requires so much extra thought to be put in, like put into them, just because of all the API chain. Like there's going to be a lot.
I agree. It's just we have this hacks to include relative path and different content units, like already in 3 plugins. And for me, it's kind of a sign that I think we need some generic solution.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not Pulp 3 line, but we have it already in many places. So, but I agree, it's a bit scary because it's invasive. All right, we have 2 minutes till the last session start.
Yep.
I'll go and pour some tea.
All right. Thanks, Guy. We'll see you in 2.
Justin, nice dark helmet.
Thanks. Is the voice changing coming through?
It seems to be. Yes. Let's talk some more.
The rebels have approached the base.
Yeah. It definitely sounds like it's modulating your voice, just not like dramatically like the Kylo Ren voice changer would. You know.
Yeah, it's nothing crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually made it to the front page of Reddit by posting Imperial propaganda.
As Kylo Ren?
Bet?
As Kylo Ren?
No, as Mike Dep 333. I mean, it's tongue in cheek. Nobody seriously thinks I support the empire or the regimes like that. But
okay.
I mean, people.
I thought you said NPR propaganda.
Yeah, no, Star Wars Imperial propaganda.
Imperial. Okay, that makes more sense.
Yeah, there's a subreddit for it called Empire Did Nothing Wrong. But like a couple of these posts got like 15K upvotes. So I love making jokes about the bad guys being the good guys in any sort of fiction, you know.
Well, the bad guys are the good guys to the bad guys.
From a certain point of view.
Yeah.
We'll get started here in one minute.
Okay.
A couple folks are co-leading the next session, but just give another minute.
Now I feel good about having made an impact.
Dude, you definitely made an impact, and just another one from this.
Should we start the next one?
Yes.
Okay. Let me hit record. Maybe I can give an outline.
Wonderful.
Cool. All right, so this next talk is about GitHub issues and Redmine. It's actually not a talk, it's more of a discussion. So this came up, I feel like, a couple of times over the past couple of weeks. We've had problems with Redmine, and I just wanted to kind of talk through it. I guess maybe we should start with the problems that we've been having with Redmine.
That sounds like a great starting point.
Would someone be willing to share their screen?
I can present.
I'll take notes.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, do we want to go through the list, or do people want to talk about what problems they've been having with Redmine?
Yes, please.
Great.
Okay. So the one of the main things I thought was that I don't feel like, as somebody who reports bugs, like I would be hesitant to sign up for a tracker just to report a bug. I think that's one of the big issues I have with Redmine. Anyone else agrees or disagrees?
Well, I mean, I can, at least from my perspective, having attempted to go through the Redmine thing, problem of creating an account on Pulp Plan.io, and more of a problem that it's almost impossible to figure out how to do the right thing on that site. I mean, there are some other Red Hat projects that also use Plan.io, and it's horrible. So I think more of the problem with even just saying, like, let's enable GitHub login and we'll use Pulp Plan.io Redmine. The bigger problem is that it's confusing and almost unusable for anyone who isn't like deeply entrenched in not just the Redmine workflow, but the Redmine workflow that Plan.io specifically offers. Because I've seen other Redmine instances that behave quite differently and much more intuitively than what Plan.io offers. So, like, from that perspective, I actually think Redmine's a better issue tracker than GitHub issues, but it's so baroque in how you interface with it that I think that causes more problems than anything else. Because people feel, like it's just, I have this idea and I have this context and I want to tell you about it, but like you make me go through unbelievable amounts of effort to do it. On the flip side, both Red Hat Bugzilla and GitHub issues, or even Pagure issues or GitLab issues or whatever, all of those are optimized for getting you from point A to point B so you can describe your problem. And then the ticket managers, so like people managing the project, can handle all the weird, funky workflow bits after the fact. This is not really the case with Pulp Plan.io, and that makes it frustrating.
Hey, Neil, do you know of any trackers that you think do a really good job, like any projects that do a really, really good job at this?
So I think there are a few projects. Actually, I think I think that's really hard to say which way that they do it well. I think the biggest issue is that you've got to, be communicative and make it easy for people to do this. And I think, like, for example, the DNF team actually has a wiki page on their in all of the projects. So like if you go into libdnf or DNF, if they have in the documentation of the project on GitHub, they walk you through what you need to do for filing a bug. Same goes for some of the other projects. And I'm using examples that deliberately don't use GitHub issues to kind of demonstrate like my point of it's not a matter of just internal or external to the project itself. It's a matter of making it easy for people to go through the flow to provide useful information. That is the missing piece when it comes to Pulp with the issue tracking, like Redmine or Pulp Plan.io. But if you guys like it, the most important part is to make it so that people can easily understand how to interface with it. Because right now, I don't know. And like that's the bigger problem I think that you guys have more than anything else.
So Neil, I pretty much agree completely with what you're saying. One of the things that I wanted to share is this how this is related to this concept of universal design. Universal design, you can read about it in a lot of places, but my understanding of it is that a great design, like let's talk about educational materials, for example. If you're going to make great educational materials, you have people with different kinds of needs, and they're at different places. Some of them learn visually, some will learn better reading, some are colorblind, others cannot hear. There are so many differences in a large population. And so the approach of universal design is to focus on designs which meet all of these needs well, and that's a really hard thing to do. But the strategy is to find the commonalities between all these things. And what some people try to do, which is not universal design, is try to scaffold around the materials all these, like, well, if you're colorblind, you should look at these images, and if you can't hear, you should not watch these videos but read these other texts. And they try to like basically produce like a bunch of different things. So I see this as very related to our problem, because I think that it would be much more effective to leverage the commonalities across the bug reporting that GitHub has created by becoming the dominant place that so many people are visually familiar with. And even though it has fewer features, it's so well understood by so many people, and so many people feel comfortable with that. I think it would just be so much better to do that than to try to build more documentation around how to use this thing that people aren't familiar with. It's a very difficult problem to solve and get right. So that's something I wanted to share, and I was thinking about, what the two paths, like build more documentation around this tool that we use that people don't understand, or change tools.
I think that you make a very good point, and I almost entirely agree with you. And I think this is one of the bigger problems that I have with Redmine, is that by default, and Plan.io exposes this more default Redmine behavior, it literally works backwards from what everybody else expects from an issue tracker. I mean, even if you look at, I hate using this as an example because I hate this system, but Track actually is a lot more intuitive than Redmine at handling issue tracking, but it's a bonkers system too. But like, at least you have a point A to point B kind of way of getting to, how do I file an issue? How do I search for an issue? How do I mark it as a duplicate? How do I these simple things? Whereas Redmine's default flow makes this incredibly difficult. Like, actually, another great example is if you look at the Ceph issue tracker. You sign into the Ceph issue tracker, you are dropped into a page with no information about anything, and you have no idea what you're doing. And I see a lot of commonality with the Ceph issue tracker with the one that Pulp has, because you get a lot of the same, like, well, what do I do questions. And this is where I'm saying I don't specifically have a problem with Redmine in itself. What I have a problem with is Plan.io, because I think they basically do it wrong. And I think, Brian, I think this is where you and I agree, is that, like, I don't think it matters specifically what implementation you use. What matters more is that user conventions are followed, like user expectations are met, and that people can be successful in providing feedback to the project. And if that means moving to GitHub issues, I mean, yes, it's a proprietary system, and I'm not particularly happy about that idea personally. I think making people more successful in terms of being part of the project is much more valuable. And I think that sums up the problem with Pulp Plan.io. Like all of these other obstacles and whatnot. Like the biggest problem with GitHub issues is that its workflow sucks. Like for the maintainer side, by far, it is an absolutely miserable experience, and I detest it with a fiery passion. But you can interface it with other third-party tools to kind of mitigate this. Like Fedora has a Taiga instance, and you can connect that to GitHub projects and use that for doing workflow tracking. And that's much better than the useless GitHub projects thing where you can't even easily link issues to workflow items and stuff like that. So, you know, maybe the answer is issue tracking on GitHub, but we start pairing this with a workflow tracking tool that makes it easier for everyone else to follow along with what's going on. And teams.fedoraproject.org might actually be a good path here because we already have that, and it's any team can request, you know, a project on it and then set up pairing to connect to their projects or do their own workflow management procedures or whatever they want. So that might be the answer here. Taiga is, I'll just spell it in the chat just so that everyone knows. Taiga. That's what it is, and that could work to fix, I think, most of the obstacles that are outlined further down in this HackMD document. Hopefully that makes some sense.
So I'll just throw in here that Neil, the points that you bring up about Plan.io are absolutely problems that I had when I first started on the Pulp team, and I would go to pulp.plan.io to the main landing page, and for a while I'd be like, I couldn't figure out how to open an issue, and it's embarrassing how long it took me to figure out the right way to search for issues. It's very capable once you find it, but it's hidden in very strange ways. And I'm not a huge fan of Plan.io. I'll observe that this list of obstacles of moving to GitHub issues are all important. They're all important things that we need to do. So we're just going to scratch out pulp.plan.io and we'll just start using GitHub issues, for me, is a non-starter, because we would lose all of the things that are listed on that list. We'd also lose things like, okay, I'm a user, I have a problem with Pulp, I go open a GitHub issue against Pulp Core. Well, it turns out, actually, no, you really had an issue with the RPM plugin. You can't move issues, they're stuck.
That's not true anymore. You can move them.
Oh, is it? Okay.
It's a beta.
Cool.
It's been a beta as long as they're all in the same org. So everything needs to be in there. You can move issues. There are quirks and there's odd gotchas, because I do this I'm one of the developers for DNF Dragora, and DNF Dragora is broken up into two components under monotools. It is DNF Dragora the front end and DNF Daemon the back end. And sometimes people file issues in DNF Dragora that actually belong in DNF Daemon, and so I just move them. So it is a thing you can do. It's kind of quirky, and the references randomly get broken, but at least you can move them. So that should be a thing.
So that's cool. That's good to know. It's been a long time since I actually gave it much thought on GitHub. But so my big stumbling block to moving is not, no, I think Plan.io is fine. There's a lot of functionality we use there that if we don't have a replacement for it, it's going to have a huge impact on us, the maintainers. One, also there's a lot of history there, and just abandoning it means losing information. And so for a long time, we would end up, either we move everything, I don't even know how to do that efficiently, or we're straddling two worlds. And my concern is that this team is large for a single team, but we have multiple large stakeholders who want us to do a lot of work. And moving tooling is not the work that any of our stakeholders cares about. So I am hesitant to take on a big chunk of work like this in the face of all the rest of the stuff that we have going on. especially if the end result means, and then we have a whole bunch of other work that we have to do that the current tool is doing for us, or at least lets us do.
But
those are my
Maybe.
I share those concerns, but I would still, I would be comfortable with, we know that a switch like this is right, but it may not be right now.
Fair.
As opposed to, and I'm less comfortable with, even though we think it's better, we aren't willing to say it is so because it's a lot of work.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I think if we want to try to find a good solution, we should not think about restrictions, time restrictions or load restrictions at the moment. We won't arrive to any good solution that way, I think. But I have one more comment on the problem. I feel like with pulpplan.io, we're kind of trying to, what I heard today, like there is a user-facing part, which is important and not friendly in plan.io. And there are our like workflows or whatever we manage for stakeholders. So there are two parts. And because we try to solve two kind of separate problems with one universal tool, it's not really good for any of those. Or we are paying with these convenience for users. So maybe it's a good idea to move user part to GitHub, and potentially have some kind of other tool integrating with it for our needs, and have it like as two separate things.
Yeah, I mean, and this is where the core of my suggestion of the idea of using Fedora's Taiga system for your workflow bits come from. Now, to be clear, I don't really have a great answer for the idea of like, well, if we retire pulpplan.io, where does the data go? Because you're going to lose basically all the useful information translating it directly into GitHub issues. If we were talking about, say, like doing a transition to, say, Pagure.io for your issue tracking, we probably could preserve a lot more of the data since the data model is very flexible for issue tracking. And they have limited Kanban board support, although I don't think it would really be enough for all the things you guys want to do. But one way to do this is that yank all the stuff from pulpplan.io, stuff it into a Pagure thing to preserve all the historical data, and then move forward with whatever you want to do for anything else. Because then at least you can decom pulpplan.io entirely. Because that's the bigger problem here, is because as long as pulpplan.io still exists, people are going to be confused, and that's even worse.
Yeah.
So
one of the and I said this when we talked about it open for, and I'll just say it here once again. What I learned from Brexit was, if we're going to make a move out of our main thing, we need to have a full plan. And so even if out of today's call we feel like it would be a better user experience and for users to have their issues reported in GitHub issues and tracked in GitHub issues, the migration plan, I think, would need to be solid into whatever system it is. And so I was the person who integrated us out of Bugzilla and into Redmine. And I believe that we could do basically the same thing we did then as to into whatever that next system is. And I believe that the bulk of we would actually do pretty well, I think, if we had a migration plan, and we should write that down at some point. But from a high level, we would file the initial description as the main issue, and we would have every comment underneath be an issue underneath it. And we would probably put pulp.plan.io into read-only mode and link back to the original issue. This is how we migrated in from Bugzilla originally. A long time ago, we used Bugzilla for the tracker. And we migrated about 2,500 to 3,000 issues. Right now, the issue count's around between 7,000 and 8,000. So machines are doing it either way. We did it before. I think we could do it again.
Yeah, no, to be clear, I don't think this is unsolvable. I just think that one of the issues that you're going to have if you wanted to do like a straight up plain migration of all the Redmine issues to GitHub is that there will be information loss because you're not going from a system to fungible systems with an extensible data model. You're going from one that does to one that doesn't, and so preserving that information is going to be functionally impossible. Is basically what I'm saying. That's why I was suggesting this like middle path of like we could do this thing to get all that historical data out, and then that lets us decom the Pulp Plan.io thing and throw to read-only or whatever you want to do. Like I imagine you're actually paying for Pulp Plan.io, so No, it's free. Well, then whatever. It's a matter of figuring out what you want to do to make sure that you have all the information you keep and that you don't lose it in the event that, say, it goes like dust in the wind. Like you just definitely don't want to do that. So
the one thing that I feel like we will lose, and I don't know how to solve this any better, is that the watches and notifications are users on that people get notified if things happen, and the initial filer, when there's movement on the issue that they filed, they get notifications through Plan.io, and I do not believe we can preserve that and so to me that's the one aspect of data that we will lose, but so I just wanted to call that out. That's the one gap in the migration plan that I really see as to your point, Neil, that we could not preserve everything.
Yeah, that's a good point, Brian. I hadn't even thought about the users in Plan.io and trying to match them to wherever we would migrate to it's a fraught with peril kind of problem. Let's put it that way. Also, I just briefly that so one absolutely was not trying to suggest if we can't do this quickly or right now, we shouldn't do it at all, because that's not even remotely what I wanted to suggest. And it sounds like we're on the same wavelength of this discussion is, should we do this? And it sounds like we're all on the same wavelength of, if the answer is yes, we're not going to pull the trigger until we know we've got a complete plan and we've got some time available to make it happen. So that makes me happy. And then I realized why I was a little anxious about this. And I realized it's because so often with this team, we identify a big problem like this and we all pitch, well, shit, that's a big problem. And we fix it right away. And it was that underlying assumption that had my adrenaline going right now. So it was a positive form of anxiety. We're just too good at fixing shit.
Well then, I don't know what to say to that.
I mean, so one of the issues that, until moving onto the Pulp team and moving onto Plan.io full time, in my previous hat, I had to work in Jira and Bugzilla and Redmine and occasionally in ServiceNow and multiple Jira instances. And it's a nightmare. It's a real nightmare. Avoiding getting into that situation where we have to pay attention to more than one thing at a time would be great. And so that's also a kind of a thought for me. As suboptimal as I find Plan.io to be, at least everything I need is in one URL. But that's a concern that isn't a showstopper concern. It's just an artifact of where we are in the 21st century. Is the XKCD multiple standards thing gets reinvented every other week. And so I don't know how to fix that.
I don't think you can. Mainly because almost every single team is semi-autonomous, and that leads to all kinds of interesting consequences in that regard. I think the best thing you can do is think about where you have to live like 80 to 90% of the time, and kind of work towards that and minimize the pain that you have to deal with the remaining 10 to 20%. I mean, I flit between personally let's see, Jira for work, because of course, not that I like it, but whatever. Bugzilla for Fedora, GitHub issues or GitLab issues or Pagure issues or like my day is like it's not evenly split or anything, but like I wind up touching maybe a dozen issue trackers over the course of a day. So the way I tend to work is that at least my personal thing is that my own personal tracking, I have a Pagure project. It is a lightweight Kanban. I file issues. I reference whatever I need to be tracking, and that works out for me. And things that support email notifications, that'll work as well. Like I basically have to develop a workflow where I recognize that I can't be in one system. And I don't know if the Pulp team has actually encountered this particular problem head on in that way, because you've got the luxury of being able to link everything straight into Pulp Plan.io. But I think in practice, you're going to wind up having to do this anyway over the course of leaving Redmine, because it is such an unappealing system, and like it is more important to be able to get, and it seems like from what everyone's saying, it's more important to help the contributing community and everyone else be successful in being part of the project. And so that's, I think, when you start with that goal and shape all of the requirements and all of the process around that, whether you use GitHub issues, which is what we're talking about now, or use Pagure, or use Bugzilla, or whatever, the point remains, the whole goal should be making people successful with interacting with the project. And as long as you keep that goal as your North Star, it becomes a lot easier to solve all the other problems.
So here's a question I'm just going to throw out there. Is there anything specific about Plan.io that people really like that we would want to make sure we could keep?
One thing for me that is important, there are two actually. It needs to be free, because to protect the long-term interests of the Pulp project, we need to avoid a situation where we could be shut down due to a gap in funding. And two, it needs to be hosted. The belief is that we need to eliminate all the things that aren't core to the value proposition of Pulp, and running a tracker system ourselves is not one of those. This is the same reason we don't run our own CI, and we don't run Jenkins, and we don't run. We don't even do our own web hosting. We actually work with another team that specializes in their dedicated mission web hosting. So those are my two asks.
I've really enjoyed linking like GitHub PRs and stuff to Redmine issues. I know we get that for free with GitHub issues, but that has been helpful. Commits and PRs and stuff.
Sure.
Yeah, I agree. Another thing is that there definitely needs to be a REST API that we can integrate other services, whether it's our own automations. Yeah, REST API.
Yeah, I agree. REST API is a must.
How flexible does what we would want to move to need to be? I know we make a lot of use of adding fields and tags and such in Plan.io. Are we addicted to that? Which would be cool if we were. Or would we be okay with a more prescriptive solution that would just say, this is the way it works, just deal with it?
I think for the workflows part, for our processes, it's important to have this flexibility. But I think if less of it is exposed to users, the better.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
The one thing I'm really kind of worried about is the fact that it's possible for Bugzillas and to link to issues, and then those issues link back to Bugzilla, so you can see if there's an attachment for a downstream issue. I don't know how we would replicate that in GitHub issues.
Yep.
I think we would probably need to focus our queries on Bugzilla only. When we need to answer questions about what's the state of downstream issues with respect to upstream issues, we would end up having all the queries run through Bugzilla's query system, which ends up probably generating a link of here are the issues at this state based on their downstream tracker.
Yeah. The one thing I like to see is if I'm working on an issue, I like, as a Red Hat employee, to see that it's linked to a Bugzilla. I was thinking maybe we could use like a tag, like a Bugzilla tag to indicate. But I guess also if we had a spreadsheet and people, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a fine option too. The Bugzilla trackers are also public, so it's not any secret that there's a downstream. And you know what? In the interest of total fairness around the code that we share, which gets productized by multiple companies, there might as well be an ATIX label at some point as well. I don't know if they want that or not, but I'm certainly open to that.
Neil, I like the Padger Kanban board because we've actually been having discussions recently. Some of us, when looking at what do you got to do for this sprint, like just the list format, and some of us much prefer the more visual layout like you have here. And we get that with plan.io, but it's interesting to see that we get it in Padger. That would be interesting.
Yeah, so I know we've been talking mostly about GitHub, but if I'm allowed to pimp out Pagger a little bit, because I tend to work on that project a lot. Pagger introduced support for a flexible Kanban in August with the 5.11 release, which is rolled out onto Pagger.io as well as Source FPO and so on and so on. Unlike most projects and systems and whatever, you can actually set up boards for every tag label that you set for issues. So for the Fedora Butterfest one, I have a development board that is mapped to the dev tag that dev label I can attach to any issue. So not treated as part of a workflow item. And I can have issues that are treated as workflow items. And while I don't have it set up right now in this issue tracker, because frankly, I didn't think about it until like this morning when we were talking about this, I can also add a custom field to map to Red Hat bugs. And the Red Hat Bugzilla tracker also already has in its data model a way to handle Pagger issues as external issues and tracking those as well. So state synchronization, relationship mapping, all those properties that you guys have in Redmine and Pulp Plan.io are actually possible in Pagger. And I'm not suggesting you move all of your stuff from GitHub for code and stuff to Pagger, but if what you want is something where you can have these two flows and make them more distinct while still simultaneously being somewhat lightweight and accessible, you could just make a Pagger project that is just for issue tracking and have the repo source, the repo have just basically documentation on like, how do you file issues, what kind of issues to file, set up the templates and so on, because issue templates are supported as well, workflow templates, all that sorts of thing. Like, be too advertisey or whatever, but like I feel like a lot of the problems you're describing seems to stem from the fact that you guys need the ability to have custom workflows encoded into your issue data so that you can both represent this to users and also keep track of it for yourselves for your own sanity. And because you have multiple downstreams, you also want to be able to represent downstream linkage information, even in the upstream project, which are all valuable things to do. And it's just, I don't know of very many things that will let you do that. Track, Pagger, and Redmine are basically the ones I'm aware of that will let you do that. I mean, of course, you could just go back to Bugzilla, but I have a feeling like basically nobody on here wants to do that. So that's kind of, I think, where I see things.
Is Pagger its own issue tracker, or can it integrate with GitHub issues?
It is its own issue tracker. It is its own project management tool in its entirety.
Okay.
Although at least it matches the syntax convention of GitHub. Not that that's particularly helpful since GitHub issues don't exist matching to the thing, but like at least the syntax matches. So like you could easily set it up so that, hey, it is mirrored into Pagure and nobody does anything with it, but it's mirrored into there. And issues would automatically close on push because it's mirrored into there, and then it would read the number and like whatever and do actions and things. Again, there's all kinds of potential opportunities here. I'm just suggesting that if you aren't too proscribed or I don't know what the word is. If you're not too stuck on GitHub issues, particularly as a solution, I just wanted to pitch this because this might also better help with that problem. And one of the folks in the OpenSUSE community, like because they manage a Redmine instance and we want to move that to a Pagure system, there's interest in maybe in developing an importer from Redmine to Pagure. And maybe this is something where the Pulp team and the guy in OpenSUSE who wants to do this can collaborate on, because there's a better understanding of Redmine, and we can match this to putting this into the Pagure importer project and have that supported as an importer mechanism. And there's my pitch.
Yeah. Well, one advantage I'm seeing just looking at this, and I feel bad for confessing that I've known about Pagure forever and have never looked at it before, which addresses the usability issue. If you're familiar with GitHub issues, the UI is familiar, right? This is something I recognize. So that might help some with the community issue, even if let's say we were to use this as our issue tracker completely. The GitHub user who comes to plan.io and is like, I have no idea what to do here, comes to this and goes, okay, this looks familiar. I at least have some road marks.
Yeah, and if you guys do eventually make that move to move your mailing lists from lists@redhat.com to lists@fedoraproject.org, most people who are subscribing will already have an account that they can interact with Pagure on, because shared SSO across the Fedora mailing list and Pagure, I understand.
Yep.
Yeah, one of the reasons I'm skeptical about Pagure, just to be upfront about it, is that I just worry that we're trading one gotta have an account, not the world's biggest UI that so many people are familiar with, even though it's similar, issue linkages natively. Those are the reasons that I'm interested in leaving Plan.io, and I worry that if we leave Plan.io just to go into another system that provides those similar things, we're not moving our interests forward.
That's a fair concern. I'm not going to discount that. I mean, from my perspective as a guy who doesn't know anything or work with your workflow very much, my main concern is is that I can't figure out Pulp Plan.io. I can do everything I want in there, I'm sure, but figuring it out is so annoyingly difficult that it doesn't matter. And I know somebody just asked about searching in there. In the issue tracker, there's a filter button right at the top, and you click on that and it lets you do searching of all kinds with tags, keywords, author submitters, whatever. But like the issue that I have with Pulp Plan.io at the core of it is there is no way for me to teach someone how to be successful with that thing. So horrible. It takes a lot of work to figure it out. And like,
that's the number one.
But being unable to figure out how to do something, that is something nobody will put up with.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've definitely asked people to go file an issue when they are on IRC, and have on multiple occasions received the feedback that I don't know what to do with this. And it's hard to explain it. And even though we have a little section in our docs on filing an issue, there is not nearly enough detail. to guide someone through that process. And if there was enough detail, it would be a really long read.
I don't think you want basic pages.
So
I want to clarify the searchable thing that I mentioned. So I meant when you do a Google search, because sometimes I just like when I have an Ansible problem, I do Ansible fatal error and something, and I can find it a solution in an issue.
Oh yeah, just Google it.
And
That tends to work fine. We Pegger issues are not made to be not Googleable. That's I realize that a lot of issue trackers do that, but we don't. So yeah, we don't have that problem, thankfully. That's one of my pet peeves of not being able to like search for it externally.
So my question about all the Fedora things, like currently Pulp is not in Fedora at all. And you say like, oh, if we move here, if we apply here, is it a prerequisite that we're in Fedora for that?
No, not even a little bit.
Okay.
I mean, I won't say no to having all this stuff in Fedora, but like, it's not a requirement. It's never been a requirement.
You know, we really want to resume our collaboration around Fedora, but that's a whole separate thing.
Oh, I know. I'm not. That's why I'm not harping on it. I'm just.
No, I'm saying from my side, like literally, it's important, and I don't think I'm the only one. We're really into it.
Yeah,
we'll harp on it for you, Neil.
Exactly.
And right, it's like I'm relatively close to completion, and that bothers me, you know.
Of course, you realize as soon as we get RPM set up and automatically building and automatically submitted in the next Fedora release, the immediate question that's going to come up is, well, why aren't you releasing these for OpenSUSE? And we'll just see how many other distributions we can get into, right?
That's
well,
the plan.
I could tell you right now that once at least one distribution package is in,
yeah,
I mean, at least that then it starts becoming way easier for others to do it too. And as I mentioned, what was it, yesterday, I think? The Cobbler project is interested in transitioning its reposync and repository backend to being Pulp based, and that will necessarily mean Pulp will need to be packaged in OpenSUSE. But once it's packaged in Fedora, it becomes way easier to do it in OpenSUSE because we will already know what needs to be done for that to happen.
Maybe we can convince Douglas to give us the spec files he had to put together to do RPM installations for stuff.
That'd probably be a good help for a starting point. Although I think Mike's pretty far along already.
I doubt you'll want my spec files.
You know, that I have heard that from every single person I've ever met that has written spec files. We're all in the same boat.
As it turns out, installing software is as hard as writing software.
Yeah, and something is not always better than nothing.
Okay, fair.
So, do we have any sort of plan for moving this forward, or?
I mean, packaging in Fedora or issue tracker, yeah.
I mean, what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I just want to have some sort of plan for us to continue this discussion or something. I don't know. We've been talking about this for a while, and we wanted to have this session today so that we could move the conversation forward. But so far, the only things that we've been able to articulate are the problems that we have. And I don't think have to make any decisions here. And I would like us to get to a point where we have some decisions, and not necessarily today.
Yeah, definitely not today, because although, I mean, obviously I've advertised my interest in the matter, I think, pretty clearly. It's such a big, important decision that I think we need a plan for what the migration would be like, and someone would need to write that plan. And at some point prototype what that would look like when time allows. And I say it all like that because this is the kind of thing that is so important that we want to make sure that there's full knowledge and broad support.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a perfectly fair way to look at it. And I mean, admittedly I kind of blew this up by talking about some of the alternatives and whatnot, but it's also important that we're talking about essentially a user experience issue, right? And we want to make sure that we make the right choice here, because while it's technically possible to undo it, I don't think anybody will really want to after we've gotten it all said and done. So we want to have, be deliberate about how we change this. And so I think what we can take away from this is that we understand the scope of the problem space, what kind of things we need to consult to build a usable path forward, and then and the alternatives that we have. Like we know a lot more than we did when we started, and so then now it's just let's figure out which path we like the least is really what it is, because there's no perfect option in any of these, right? So it's which option we dislike the least, and then work with the relevant folks to move forward on that. I think I've summed that up pretty well.
I agree. You have. And so my question is, could we hear some feedback from folks who are interested in collaborating on a plan like that? I mean, whatever's written is going to go out for review, our normal transparency first approach. But is there anybody who's interested in collaborating on it? I'm interested, for example.
Yeah, me too.
I'm interested.
Well.
Great.
Okay. So I can set up a meeting next week to maybe meet and then try to work on moving this forward and having a plan that we can send out for feedback. Who was interested? I saw Brian. Neil, did you say you were interested?
Yep, I did.
Okay, Tanya and Grant. Okay, I can set up a meeting for like next week and we can talk.
Sure, sounds fine to me.
Do you guys want to do like a video call like this, or are you guys gonna meet in Pulp meeting on chat?
Video calls are amazing.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to put that out there because that is an option. We hold some of our meetings as chat, but yeah, I agree. Video goes a long way.
Also, given how little I see people, I appreciate video a lot more. I feel like I'm not alone in that feeling.
I agree.
I'm not sure we can promise silly hats next week, though, Neil. I'm running out of hats, so.
Oh. Well, I'll have to see if I can find some hats of my own, because, like, I'm not usually much of a hat buyer, and so that makes this a little hard. But we'll see.
That's great.
I think we have some Pulp hats that we might need to find a home for. So.
And so we're at our time. It's lunchtime. One thing I wanted to mention though before we sign off is that there are lightning talks tomorrow. If you're interested and want to give like a 5 to 7 minute presentation, any topic is fair game as long as you think it's interesting to people here. For those. That's all I had.
Cool beans. It's been a great morning, folks. Neil, thanks again for showing up. Douglas, you guys have been a huge addition to these.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And you guys are great as well. I'm glad you guys hold this like kind of open freely accessible virtual conference thing. It's a nice change of pace, actually.
You know, I really liked, I think there was a lot that happened last year. We did this in person in Brno, and we got a lot out of that, and especially out of the stuff that happened after the daily meetings. But doing stuff virtually makes it possible for a much larger group of people to show up. So we have to think as a team about maybe doing, when we were allowed to do in-person stuff, still doing a virtual PulpCon in addition to the in-person one.
I mean, to be fair, I didn't know you guys did a PulpCon at all before now. So there is that. So
yep.
Yeah, it's definitely more inclusive.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, plus by the time we're able to hold these in person, Mel will have had at least another year, maybe two, and everyone on the planet will know about Pulp. So we'll have to reserve a conference center.
Yeah, PulpCon will be huge.
That's right.
I'm going to end this recording.
Yes.
Oh yeah, totally about that.
All right, gang, very cool. I'm gonna go grab some lunch. I've got meetings.
All right.
Cool.
David,
See
we'll
ya.
get my PR after lunch.
Thanks, gang. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.